Terence Etherton with a number of recommendations which at the moment we are working through. When we respond, it'll be a proper response and I hope will satisfy him.
Minister Rachel Hopkins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, you're going to be... sorry, the Minister's... the Minister will be pressed again for his response. He won't have to wait until Saturday. Because until 2000 it was illegal to be gay in the UK Armed Forces. The loss of livelihoods and long-term suffering endured by LGBT+ veterans as a result of this cruel and unjust policy has been immense. I'm pleased that there is such cross-party agreement about the publication of this report being so important to those who have experienced such injustice. So 18 months on, there is still no report yet and no government apology. So will the Minister confirm to the House specifically when the report will be published in full with all testimony and when we can expect an apology from the Prime Minister for this historic injustice?
Grateful to the Honourable Lady. It is this government that set up this review. 1967 to 2000 this was going on. It was an appalling stain on all of us. And I'm really pleased that this government at long last has gripped this. I'm afraid she's going to have to be a little bit more patient, but I suspect we will be publishing this report and a response very soon indeed.
Emma Lilbert.
3, please, Mr Speaker.
The government has injected over £29 billion of additional funding into defence since 2020, investing in army modernisation, major platforms like the Type 26, Type 31, Challenger 3 and F-35, and restocking of ammunition in order to make sure that we reverse the hollowing out of our armed forces that has occurred under successive governments for the last 30 years.
Emma Lilbert.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for that response. But only recently, the Deputy Secretary said Britain is just holding on to its status as one of NATO's leading organisations and that our army is too small. Former CDS said that all of our armed forces are too small, with the army having significant capability deficiencies. The government are failing our forces, aren't they?
Well, it's interesting because, of course, it was the party opposite that cut 19 battalions from the army when I was serving under her government. I would secondly say that what's very important, Mr Speaker, is that the size of the army is not only important that it's the right size, but it is an army that is properly equipped and able to do its job. Having just numbers and non-equipment leads to a place where we ended up with snatched Land Rovers in Afghanistan under her government.
Select Committee, Tobias Elwood.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Could I endorse the words of my Defence Select Committee colleague? But the Secretary of State himself used the words hollowing out of our armed forces. The head of the army today said at the RUSI Land Warfare Conference that our world is heading back into the 1930s with growing threats. Would he agree that the Treasury's argument to increase defence spending to 2.5% when the economics improve is not only naive, but it's also illogical, because our economy and our national security are one and the same thing. We need to invest in our army and air force and navy now, not when the economy, Britain's economy, improves.
My right honourable friend makes an important point about the levels of defence spending. First of all, spend on the army is 20% higher since I have started as Defence Secretary, and I have made sure that a greater proportion of that spend is spent on catching up and modernising the armed forces that has been neglected all the way back to Afghanistan and Iraq, where we were spending money on UORs rather than the core budget to modernise that equipment. On his point about the Treasury has also accepted, as the Chancellor did from this dispatch box, that defence will require a greater share of public spending. Part of the big challenge is that we recognise that the culture has changed across government, that in Whitehall, defence requires and needs a greater proportion if it is to defend these shores and indeed our people. That is how it used to be. I'm confident the Prime Minister's support of 2.5% and indeed the Chancellor's position is a path in the right direction, and of course it couldn't be needed quicker.
We come to Shadow Secretary of State, John Healy.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In January, the Defence Secretary admitted that his government have hollowed out and underfunded our armed forces. And in the last week, a string of senior military figures have agreed. NATO's second-in-command said the British Army is too small. A former Chief of the Defence Staff has said the Army is now too weak. And another ex-CDS has said the hollowing out of warfighting resilience within the armed forces has been the single most obvious shortfall since 2010. Will the Defence Secretary halt this hollowing out in his new Defence Command paper, and will this be published this month as he's promised?
First of all, Mr. Speaker, time and time again, the right honourable gentleman comes to this House knowing full well that my statements on hollowing out are not about this government, it's about successive governments for the last 30 years. Mr. Speaker, I would ask you to look at that statement, because that statement verges on misleading the House, Mr. Speaker. It verges on it. He knows that is the fact. I have consistently pointed out that that is not the case, but he continues to use this in this House. The way we have started to reverse is an increase of £29 billion into the core funding of the armed forces. And whatever I have done with that new money, Mr. Speaker, I have made sure that it is there to properly equip all the people of the armed forces and properly support them. There is no point playing a numbers game when men and women could be sent to the front line without the right equipment. Yep. All we see from the party opposite is a numbers game without any money attached.
Yeah. John Healey.
Well, I have his exact words here, Mr. Speaker. It's January the 30th, column 18 of Hansard, and after inviting me to get Labour's shortcomings off my chest, he said, "I am happy to say that we have hollowed out and underfunded." Now, he boasts about being the longest-serving Tory Defence Secretary, but in 4 years, he's failed to halt this hollowing out, he's failed to fix the broken procurement system, he's failed to win fresh funding this year, even to cover inflation, and he's failed to stop service morale reaching record lows. Does he not see it as a national embarrassment for Britain to go to next month's NATO summit as one of only 5 NATO nations that has not rebooted defence plans since President Putin invaded Ukraine?
Okay. On that quote, Mr. Speaker, I said if he admits that Labour had hollowed it out under its term of office. How convenient to forget that the whole point is that in 30 years, the point was after the Cold War, successive governments pushed defence to the side and not to the centre. And when he talks about my record in defence, let's look at defence procurement, because he's fond of coming to the dispatch box about that. In 2009 under Labour, 15% of projects coming out of the armed forces were overpriced, overcost, and 28% of them, the average delay was 28%. It's now 4% are overcost and 15% of each project is delayed. We cut the bureaucracy in DNS from over 27,000 to 11,400. That's value for money, and at the same time, we've got a real increase in the defence budget, and we've injected £29 billion of additional funding.
Rebecca Longby.
Question number 4, Mr. Speaker.
I know the Honourable Lady will welcome the commemorative nuclear test medal announced by the Prime Minister in November last year to recognise service veterans and civilian personnel who participated in the UK's atmospheric nuclear test programme between 1952 and 1967. The first nuclear test medals are expected to be available this autumn, I hope in time for Remembrance Sunday.
Rebecca Longby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've heard it all before. Governments come and go, but the nuclear veterans keep fighting. That's exactly what we did for our country all them years ago. So please, no more false promises, just action. Award us our medal. Those are the words of a nuclear testing veteran who speaks for the thousands promised medallic recognition by the Prime Minister on the 22nd of November last year. Yet they are now sadly informed that the medal has been delayed again by the government. So can I ask the Minister, what is the delay? Why is it happening? And can he categorically promise the House today that these veterans, whose average age is now 85, will finally be awarded their medals before Remembrance Sunday, so that they and their descendants can proudly wear their medals?
Minister.
Once again, I have to remind the Honourable Lady, it's this government that's got on and done this. The announcement was made on the 22nd of November last year, and I very much hope that by the 22nd of November this year, they will be getting their medals. It is my sincere hope that by Remembrance Sunday, they will be able to proudly wear what is due to them.
Jason McCall.
Question 5, please, Mr. Speaker.
With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to answer questions 5 and 18 together. The UK continues to be recognised as the leading nation providing military support to Ukraine training over 17,000 recruits and providing $2.3 billion of support last year and this year. We've sent hundreds of thousands of rounds of artillery, ammunition, thousands of missiles and hundreds of armoured vehicles, and we've led the world on gifting of vital capabilities such as multiple launch rocket systems, Challenger 2 and Storm Shadow missiles.
Jason McCall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As well as contributing through the International Fund for Ukraine and the Ukraine Defence Contact Group, I really welcome that the UK has contributed an additional £60 million to NATO's comprehensive assistance package for Ukraine, which focuses on capacity building in key areas such as cyber and logistics. What is my right honourable friend's assessment of whether Ukraine is receiving the right kind of assistance from NATO to support their longer-term ambitions for NATO membership?
NATO's comprehensive assistance package to Ukraine is providing urgent non-lethal assistance to enable the defence of Ukraine. The CAP also focuses on meeting Ukraine's longer-term needs, including reconstruction and transition to NATO standards, essential for countries wishing to join the alliance. Since February 2022, the UK has contributed £82 million to the CAP.
Vicky Ford.
Mr. Speaker, in the past few days there have been deeply alarming reports in our press that the Russian forces may have placed highly destructive mines at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. What assessment has he made of the risk of a major nuclear incident?
My honourable friend asked a very important question about the risk posed by Russian activity, not only within his own borders, but obviously within Ukraine and the nuclear power station Zaporizhzhia. Of course, sadly, Russia is a country that's shown no restraint in using munitions against civilian structures, critical national infrastructure, hospitals, surgeries and other likes, and which adds to the long list of war crimes that they have clearly been engaged in. We monitor it very closely. We work with the international community to make sure that everything that can be done is done to protect that nuclear power station, and reminding not only through ourselves but through third countries Russia of its obligations to protect the people and the civilian population.
Christopher Bryant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I fully support all the munitions that we've been able to provide to Ukraine, and I hope we'll be able to continue doing that for the foreseeable future, and certainly until Putin loses. But can I just ask him, it seems quite often that different countries, different allies of Ukraine are giving different kinds of bits and pieces of armament and munitions, and that doesn't necessarily add up to more than the sum of its parts. Wouldn't it be better if we now looked forward into the future by commissioning jointly so that we were getting more material at cost directly through to Ukraine?
The Right Honourable Gentleman makes a really important point. First of all, in order to better coordinate the gifting, we set up at the beginning the IDCC, the International Donor Coordination Cell, with about 80 British personnel in the lead of that alongside the United States, to make sure that what they were asking for is what they got, but also it was coordinated across the international community, because we all have different armories. But also in recognition of his very important point about how do we develop and encourage a sustainable supply chain to them. Britain, alongside Denmark, set up the International Fund. We've already committed £250 million last year and another £250 million this year. It's topping up towards €1 billion of funding plus, did specifically with one of the tasks to commission from effectively supply chains and manufacturing plants. So there's a long-term solution to their need to make sure that rolling off the production lines is that munition, because we all have finite stocks, and that's why we're going to use the cash in that fund to start commissioning, and we already have done.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Liberal Democrats are supportive of what the Secretary of State sets out in terms of the supply of arms and equipment to Ukraine for its sovereign defence. I wonder whether the Secretary of State has assessed what effect the Storm Shadow missile has had on operations, and also whether he could let us know whether other allies, such as the United States, also intend to provide long-range precision-guided missiles.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman. The Storm Shadow missile has had a significant impact on the battlefield is my understanding. Its accuracy and its ability to deliver successfully the payload as sent and designed by the Ukrainians has been almost without fault. And I think that is an extraordinary achievement of both of the engineering that went in it, but also of the Ukrainians to deploy it and use it as they need to. It has had an effect on the Russian army, mainly around its logistics and its command and control. It shows the importance of deep fires, and we absolutely would urge other international partners to come forward with their deep fires that are required. When HIMARS was put in the M270s, that has a range of 80 kilometres, that had a similar effect, and then the Russians moved many of their C2 nodes out of range, which is why deep fires became important. I think the key here is to recognise that if the Russians move out of range, we must work together internationally to make sure that the equipment is given to make sure they are back in range.
Robinson.
Question 6, Mr. Speaker.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I'll answer questions 6 and 13 together. Last week, the Ministry of Defence published the Haythornthwaite Review into Armed Forces Incentivisation. Rick Haythornthwaite and his team have done an absolutely brilliant job. Defence is now working out how to implement the recommendations, but I think it's true to say that Haythornthwaite addresses our pressing need to build a firm foundation for an increasingly skills-based future in which Defence will have to compete extremely hard if it is to continue to recruit and retain the very best.
Robinson.
In February of last year, we were informed that the Ministry of Defence was actively considering recruiting people with neurodiversity. This will have given hope to many, including my constituent, who does not believe his autism diagnosis should be a barrier to service. Could my right honourable friend advise what is the status of these considerations, and would they look at running a pilot scheme so that neurodiverse individuals are encouraged to give their skills to the armed forces?
Well, look, we're really proud of the wide-ranging makeup of our armed forces, including many neurodiverse people currently. The Haythornthwaite Review recognises that tomorrow's defence will be very different to today's, and its people will be too. I agree with the thrust of my honourable friend's very perceptive question, and anticipate that the skills and attributes we will need in the future will mean casting the net much wider than before.
Sir Len Sachs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In North Devon, our two military bases, Chivner and Arromanches, have units specialising in logistics, engineering and unmanned marine technologies. What steps is my right honourable friend taking to encourage more budding young engineers to fulfil their technical education and work prospects within our armed forces?
Look, the Ministry of Defence is deeply committed to supporting future engineers, both inside and outside the armed forces. The MOD is one of the largest deliverers of UK apprenticeships. We have 22,000 on 100 different apprenticeships at any one time. Furthermore, the Haythornthwaite Review and the Pan Defence Skills Framework will take skilling of our defence people to the next level.
Jim Shan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Minister very much for his response? When it comes to cyber security, Northern Ireland leads as one of the leading regions of the United Kingdom that are pushing that very, very hard. Does the Minister and has the Minister given any consideration to ensuring that companies that are involved in cyber security, we have many in Northern Ireland and south east of England here as well, could work in partnership with the MOD to ensure that those skills that have in private partnership are used in the Army?
I absolutely agree with the honourable gentleman. I think one of the things we are going to see in the future is much more zigzagging between the armed forces and the industry. And back again, as it happens, so-called zigzag careers, and Haythornthwaite touches upon some of that. Going forward, I anticipate a much closer relationship, working relationship, between the armed forces and industry. We're all in it together.
So, Mr. Luke Pollard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Armed Forces Day last week, as a nation, we thanked our armed forces for their service. And as a nation, we rightly invest in the skills of those who serve. But year after year, we are seeing more people with essential skills leaving the forces. Satisfaction with service life has plummeted from a recorded high of 61% under Labour in 2009 to 42% today. And, Mr. Speaker, it's even lower at 39% for junior ranks. So can the Minister tell the House what is his plan to restore morale, to help keep the skills we need in our armed forces? And by the time of the next general election, will morale in our forces be higher or lower than it is today?
Well, I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman. It's a great pleasure to see him in Falmouth for National Armed Forces day at the weekend. The Armed Forces Continuous Attitude Survey was established in 2007 by the previous Labour government, and it's interesting to look back at what the figures were then. There was no Labour nirvana. We find from the figures in 2007 that the percentage saying morale is high is about the same or higher compared with 2007 as it is now. Well, he may chunter, but these are the facts. The percentage feeling valued has gone up significantly, as has the percentage who would recommend their career to a friend. Hardly surprising, things like satisfaction with kit is much better now than it was then. Remember 2007 with Snatch Land Rovers, coffins on wheels. We remember, don't we, the absolutely appalling kit that the then Labour government provided to our armed forces in Iraq and then Afghanistan. I think the record Labour has is nothing to be proud of.
Tom Randall.
Question 7, sir.
I regularly engage with NATO allies, including most recently at the NATO Defence Ministers meeting on the 15th and 16th of June, where we demonstrated our continued solidarity with Ukraine and preparations for the upcoming Vilnius Leaders Summit. We lobbied hard and successfully for Finnish NATO membership, resulting in their historic accession, and we hope to achieve the same for Sweden before long.
Mr. Speaker, I welcome the announcement at the NATO Defence Ministers Conference that NATO has agreed a new UK-based maritime centre to support the security of undersea infrastructure. Can my right honourable friend assure me that this new centre is part of a long-term plan for the Alliance to secure better critical undersea infrastructure? And can he provide any further details on the role of this new unit?
Mr. Speaker, I'm delighted that NATO will host its new maritime centre for the security of critical undersea infrastructure in the UK. This centre is part of NATO's long-term plan to better secure our undersea infrastructure. Bringing together allies and industry, the centre will result in greater situational awareness and sharing of intelligence, expertise and innovation, and will also complement the latest Royal Navy ship, the RFA Proteus, whose job is to actually go out and monitor those critical supply lines and cyber cables.
Cavan Jones.
NATO was created to protect democracy and safeguard the values that underpin it. A year ago, the NATO Parliamentary Assembly passed a resolution under the presidency of Congressman Jerry Connolly to create a Democracy and Resilience Centre within NATO. I understand this has been agreed by all nations bar one. I wonder whether the Secretary of State, the upcoming summit, can put some effort behind actually persuading that one member to agree to this initiative.
Well, what it best is for me is to write to the right honourable member about the details of that. I will look at it. I'm happy to discuss with him what he thinks needs to progress, and we'll get to the bottom of it.
Sir Julian Lewis.
Question 9, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I was delighted to announce the War Widows ex gratia payment scheme last month. A specialist team is being stood up to deal with applications and assist and advise widows when the process opens. This will ensure that people are treated with the care they deserve and that their individual needs are met. The scheme will start as soon as possible and in any event by this autumn and will be open for 2 years. It won't erase their loss, but I hope this payment will offer some comfort to those affected. Can I again pay tribute to the staunch, dignified campaigning of the War Widows Association, which has brought us to this point, and also pay tribute to my right honourable friend who has been absolutely full square behind the campaign.
Sir Julian Lewis.
Well, in return, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank ministers for persevering with this in the face of many obstacles erected by the Treasury. There is just one last hurdle to surmount, and that is the question of taxation of the ex gratia payment. Given that the pensions, war widows' pensions themselves, are a recognition of sacrifice and not a benefit, they are not taxed. If this ex gratia payment is taxed, some war widows will get only slightly more than half the lump sum concerned. Will he use his very best endeavours to avoid that unintended and unfortunate result of an otherwise successful initiative?
Yeah, I fully understand the point my right honourable friend is making. He will know that the payment was uplifted to take into account tax. I appreciate it may not be taking care of all tax in many, if not most, circumstances. What I will say to him, without setting any hairs running, is I'm having a conversation with colleagues, but I would emphasise it is around how we deal with tax on this payment, and I can't really give him any more comfort than that.
Question number 10, please, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The MOD works closely with UK industry and academia, including SMEs, to identify and invest in innovative technologies that address our most pressing capability challenges, as well as publishing our future priorities to incentivise investment. We are transforming processes to drive this at pace, and we are already testing and deploying these technologies.
Mr. Speaker, the integrated review said that AI would be used to strengthen defence capabilities. So in what ways are the armed forces using AI, and will he agree that weapon systems should always be subject to direct human control and never be allowed to operate autonomously?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend asked an excellent question, and I know there is huge public interest in the matter of AI. Just to be clear, so the Defence AI strategy last year set out our intent to develop and use artificial intelligence ambitiously, safely and responsibly. To be clear, we do not rule out incorporating AI within weapon systems, but we are clear that there must be context-appropriate human involvement in weapons which identify, select and attack targets. The UK does not possess fully autonomous weapon systems and has no intention of developing them. Finally, any weapon system used by the UK military would be governed by the MOD's robust framework of legal, safety and regulatory compliance regimes, irrespective of the technology involved.
Nick Smith.
Mr. Speaker, Morpheus is a next-generation £3 billion defence communication programme. It's meant to replace the Bowman kit on Ajax vehicles. Wow. It was originally set for introduction in 2025, but ministers have recently said a revised IOC is to be determined. Minister, when can we please have a statement on the state of play and the delivery of Morpheus?
Well, I'm going with the Honourable Gentleman. He asked an important question. This is an important programme. We are still committed to Morpheus, but there is a limit to what I can say at the moment because we are having contractual discussions with the supplier, but I hope I can say more in due course. As to Ajax, just to be absolutely clear, the intention is to upgrade the Bowman operating system within Ajax as the next step.
Leicester.
Question 11.
With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I'll answer this question together with question 16. We're driving the delivery of capability to the front line. Over a 2-year period to December 22, we have seen a 1-year reduction in the average programme duration, but we can do more to improve, and we are committed to learning the lessons of the Sheldon Review.
Bill Leicester.
On the 13th of March, the Defence Secretary told me that UK steel was not specified in defence procurement because, in his words, we do not manufacture the type of steel required. But according to UK steel producers, this isn't true, as they adjust production lines to match the needs of each contract. Now he knows that our steel producers can deliver. Will he do what all other major countries do for reasons of national security and guarantee to use domestically produced steel in defence procurement?
Well, I actually don't accept that. I mean, I'm happy to write to him with the details. Our position is, obviously, we want to use UK steel. We recognise its quality, but there will be cases where the appropriate steel has to be sourced from elsewhere, and obviously, ultimately, we have to deliver the equipment that is required for our capabilities.
John Speller.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I say it's probably a bit of a shame that after he missed out on the Secretary of State, Secretary of NATO job, that the Secretary of State seems to have reverted to no more Mr. Nice Guy mode today. But it may improve as the day goes on. But can I ask the Minister in an amicable way, why, when following Ukraine, every major military industrial power is relentlessly focused on building domestic industrial capacity? Yep. Why is he stubbornly refusing to do the same? And his last answer on steel shows again the mindset hasn't changed. So why won't he back British industry and British military resilience?
Well, I'm happy to be Mr. Nice Guy when it comes to British industry. We're absolutely clear in DCIS. A central tenet of DCIS is that industrial capacity is a part of our defence capability. I'm absolutely clear about that. Of course, we want to have a strong domestic industry. There are occasions when acquisition has to be undertaken at pace, and we've seen in respect of Ukraine getting the equipment out to them, we have had to be flexible in how we source that. But absolutely, we are committed to a strong industrial base for defence, both at SME level and with our primes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will my honourable friend look at how the MOD could support the UK's domestic supply chain by requiring prime contractors to adhere to a 30-day payment code for all defence suppliers, regardless of where they sit in the supply chain?
Well, my honourable friend is a champion of SMEs, and he makes an excellent point about prompt payment. I can assure him that the MOD has a standard contract term that requires primes to pay suppliers within 30 days. I am informed this is called DEFCON 534, obviously not to be confused with other uses of the word DEFCON, but it's a very important point. Like him, I want to see our SMEs supported. He makes an excellent point.
Shadow Minister Chris Evans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When I asked the Minister of Defence Procurement during the statement on the Sheldon Review 2 weeks ago, he recognised the importance of workers to the defence industry. Now, we've already heard from my honourable friend from Blaenau Gwent about the problems with Morpheus, which I understand is now rated red by the MOD. The problem we had in Ajax are also emerging in Morpheus. And one of the things that came out of the Shelton Review was that the company was not listening to the voices of workers on the shop floor. What guarantees is he putting in place to ensure workers have a reporting back system to ensure when things are going wrong, like with Ajax or potentially Morpheus, that these are reported and listened to and acted upon?
Well, I said in the statement that I recognised the unique angle he has on this, because of course he's constituency MP in respect of the factory in question. What I would stress is obviously the legal employment of those employees is responsibility of the company. We engage closely with them, and actually one of the lessons learned is about that close engagement at SRO level through DNS. I think Andy Start, CEO of DNS, Mr. Speaker, has led huge change there in improving the way we work together, and I am bound to say I suspect we will continue to build on the significant improvement the Secretary of State just highlighted in terms of both cost and timing between when they were last in power.
SNP spokesperson Dave Dugan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The previous Defence Procurement Minister impressed many with hitting the ground running. He developed a forensic grip on the manifold issues within this dysfunctional area of defence, and he worked up a plan to try and deal with that. Sadly, he moved on before he could implement that plan. So can I ask this latest Defence Procurement Minister if he has a plan, and what will be the first evidence of that plan that our weary service personnel and taxpayers might see?
Well, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Gentleman for his praise for my brilliant colleague, the Right Honourable Member for Cheltenham, who is now, of course, Justice Secretary and Lord Chancellor, no less. What I would say to him is absolutely we have a plan. Of course, that plan must take account of the lessons from the Sheldon Review. I recognise in taking on this job there's been huge focus on Ajax, but I would just put it like this. The fact that Ajax is now with the Household Cavalry for regular field training, I hope, is a symbolic moment of showing we're turning the corner. We're going to engage right across defence to develop a better procurement system, and I want to ensure that delivers better outcomes, which is why I've also tasked the Permanent Secretary, as I said to the Select Committee, to undertake an end-to-end review of the whole defence operating model.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That response could have been loosely regarded as a kind of a stab at the previous question, but certainly not an attempt at answering mine. So let me try and probe a little further and give the Minister some examples which he may wish to bombast us with about his progress that he's making. How has he challenged the pedestrian progress towards the next phase of the new medium-lift helicopter tender? What is the delay with the Type 32 or Type 31 successor announcement? And why doesn't his element of defence procure ground-based anti-air missile systems to protect these islands in a more responsible way?
Well, he's ranged a long way there from air to ground. So I would just say that the key element here is to strengthen the speed and agility of our procurement, whatever the platform in question. Some of the platforms you refer to actually at the conceptual phase anyway. I'm committed, Mr. Speaker, to driving pace because ultimately what this is about isn't just we don't want to have the delays we've seen in some notable programmes whilst noting that overall time is improving. Mr. Speaker, we need pace because that's how we maintain our competitive edge ultimately with our international adversaries.
This will be helpful as well. Matt Weston.
Number 12, please, sir.
The Ministry of Defence fully recognises the importance of safe, good quality and well-maintained homes. In the last 7 years, Defence has invested more than £936 million in service family accommodation. This includes £185 billion last year on modernising homes, tackling damp and mould and improving thermal efficiency. Currently, 97% of mod SFA meet or exceeds the government's decent home standards. Only these properties are allocated to service families. We strive to do better, Mr. Speaker, but for context, the figure for social housing is 91%.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the Minister will have noticed when he's been around various sites that just the substandard quality of the accommodation, indeed squalor in certain cases. And the Minister will also know that there are some 800 armed forces families living in potentially unsafe homes that have not yet had gas safety checks. Can the Minister confirm what action he is taking in his government to make these homes safe?
Yeah, well, I'm grateful to the for the question, Mr. Speaker. On gas and electric safety, my honourable friend, the Minister of Defence Procurement, was made aware of this issue on the 2nd of May, and he worked exceptionally quickly to remedy the issue. Currently, there are some 555 gas safety certificates outstanding. That number is plummeting dramatically, and I can tell him that they'll be cleared, almost all cleared, by the end of June. I think that's a measure of some success.
Mr. Speaker, if a private or professional landlord didn't properly complete these safety checks, they would be sued. It's completely unacceptable that we put armed forces personnel and their loved ones at risk 4 months because the FDIS contract that is meant to do this is completely broken. If the head of the Defence Infrastructure Organisation, who's meant to oversee this, is completely out of his depth, which some of us believe he is, after this, shouldn't he consider his position?
Well, I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend. I think the important thing is that our honourable friend, the Minister, when he got to know about this, acted immediately to put the matter right. I'm not really interested in getting people's scalps. I'm interested in putting the matter right, and that's exactly what is happening.
Andrew Bridgen.
14, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Good afternoon. The UK applied to the Permanent Structured Cooperation and Military Mobility Project to help shape EU military transport procedures and infrastructure, addressing impediments to moving military personnel and assets across Europe at pace. We are negotiating the technical terms of our participation in the form of an administrative agreement, and we have reached agreement on the majority of the text.
Andrew Bridgen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sir Richard Dearlove, former head of MI6, has given evidence to House committees on this issue, and he questioned why we were joining this and who had authorised it. He also stated that membership of these European Union defence structures are not an a la carte menu where the UK can choose what it wants and reject what it doesn't. It's very much a take it or leave it, all or nothing situation. Does the Minister agree with Sir Richard's assessment?
Well, Mr. Speaker, conspiracy isn't as rife as the honourable gentleman seems to think. You can indeed choose which parts of PESCO you wish to be in, and the mobility project, which coordinates the development of infrastructure for the movement of NATO weapons and platforms across Europe, seems to be a pretty good thing on which the UK should seek to cooperate with the EU on.
David Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As my right honourable friend has mentioned, the UK at the moment is considering acceding only to the military mobility element of PESCO. There are, however, over 60 separate elements. Can my right honourable friend indicate whether the government is considering joining any of those other elements?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we'll consider them on a case-by-case basis. Where there is merit and where it is in the UK interests to work with the European Union to the advantage of NATO and our own national interest, we will, of course, do so. But we won't do so blindly out of habit, only when it's in our interests.
Stop it, Scott Benson.
Number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, as part of their summer campaign to reclaim illegally occupied territory, Ukraine has already recaptured approximately 300 square kilometres. That's more territory than Russia seized in its whole winter offensive. They continue to make gradual but steady tactical progress, undertaking major offensive operations on three main axes in the south and eastern Ukraine. In the Luhansk Oblast, Russian forces have made their own significant effort to launch an attack in the Sebryanka forest near Crimea. Russia has had some small gains, but Ukrainian forces have prevented a breakthrough. In Donetsk Oblast, Ukraine has gained impetus in its assaults around Bakhmut. In multiple brigade operations, Ukrainian forces have made progress on both the north and southern flanks of the town. Russia do not appear to have the uncommitted ground forces needed to counter the multiple threats it is now facing from Ukraine, which extends over 200 kilometres from the Bakhmut to the eastern bank of the Dnieper River.
Scott Benton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What discussions is the government having with other NATO members to ensure that every member of the alliance meets the 2% spending target?
I think as Vilnius approaches, Mr. Speaker, it's very, very important that we recommit and get other nations to recommit to make sure that 2% is viewed as a floor, not a ceiling. It's regretful that still only 7 to 8 nations in NATO are reaching that target. Britain is, of course, above the 2%. It's very important. Freedom is not free. You have to pay for it in the end.
Sir Secretary of State John Healey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister told last week's Ukraine Recovery Conference we will maintain our support for Ukraine's defence and for the counter-offensive. With the developments in recent days, surely now's the time to accelerate, not just maintain, our military support for Ukraine.
Well, our support from Ukraine is made up of 2.3 billion. Not all of that is committed, and we continue to make sure that whatever Ukraine needs, we can try and give, and if we don't have it, whether we can use our network around the world to access it on their behalf. It's also important to make sure that we all focus on this offensive and give Ukraine what it needs for that offensive. The key test will be getting through all those defensive lines and to make sure that Russia is pushed back and is challenged from going into effectively a frozen conflict that Russia would, of course, like. I think it's important, though, to note it's easy for the comfort for all of us in London to say that. There are men and women of the Ukrainians going through minefields, through horrendous obstacle crossings, and facing an army that commits war crimes every single day.
Is the Secretary of State confident that Sweden's NATO membership application will be approved this year?
I think, Mr. Speaker, I'd say I'm optimistic. I had my phone call with my new Turkish counterpart last week. It was one of the first subjects I raised. I have also spoken consistently and on many occasions with Turkey and the leadership. I am confident that we will get there in the end. Sweden has made significant strides in its counter-terrorism legislation to deal with some of the issues that Turkey raised, and I think Turkey now recognises that as a strong effort.
John Speller.
Mr. Speaker, can the Minister give us a progress report on the contract for the Fleet Solid Support ships? And given that 3 of these are equivalent to 2 aircraft carriers in size, can you confirm where's the steel coming from?
Well, he's very persistent, and I will have to check that point for him.
Tom Randall.
Mr. Speaker, I was recently invited to visit the Army Cadets in Arnold in my Gedling constituency and see the work they're doing and the skills they're learning from drill instruction to CPR. Now, I was never a cadet myself, but would my right honourable friend join me in congratulating the work that Ben Mickle in Arnold and others across Nottinghamshire are doing in running cadet services, and would he encourage children and young people to take part?
I thank my honourable friend very much for that. I do congratulate Staff Sergeant Mickle and his fellow instructors. I think many of us were out and about for National Armed Forces Day on Saturday, Mr. Speaker, and saw some of our wonderful cadets, and I pay tribute to all those instructors who put in so many hours to make it all possible.
Well, Ribiradi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've been asking the Prime Minister and other ministers about government bodies spying on the activities of British citizens, including politicians, activists and journalists. In a statement issued in 2020, the Ministry of Defence said that the British Army's information warfare unit, the 77th Brigade, do not and have never conducted any kind of action against British citizens. But then on the 30th of January this year, the Secretary of State said that the 77th Brigade scours Twitter to assess UK disinformation. So can the Minister clarify whether the 77th Brigade can conduct any surveillance actions against British citizens, for what purpose, and if this is really the best use of their time?
Of course, a whole range of agencies, including 77th Brigade, will study media platforms that deliver social media to our citizens in this country, and where that comes from is obviously sometimes of a concern if it is from a foreign state trying to manipulate our young people. As a former security minister, I used to see the radicalisation, the exploitation, the sexual exploitation of people through those platforms, and I think we should all be grateful that we do monitor those systems.
Mr. Speaker, questions today have highlighted how important strong deterrence is at the moment, and accordingly, and I'm sure both people across the UK and my constituents will be taking a real keen interest in the outcomes of the NATO Leaders Summit in Vilnius in a couple of weeks. So I wondered if my right honourable friend could perhaps just outline what he believes or would consider to be positive outcomes for the UK defence at that summit.
The Right Honourable Lady asks a really important question about Vilnius. It is an important moment in NATO, obviously comes on the heels of war in Europe and the invasion of Ukraine. The Vilnius summit is important because it also is the transition from NATO, where allies will build on those commitments they made at Madrid summit and go further and faster to bolster Euro-Atlantic security. The UK remains committed to supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes. The most powerful deterrent is our commitment to Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, backed up by modern, credible forces, and it continues to hold firm.
With the conclusion of the events on Saturday in Russia being that Prigozhin has been relocated to Belarus and Russian tactical nuclear weapons also being relocated to Belarus, has the Secretary of State undertaken an assessment of the threat to Belarus, which is on the eastern flank of NATO and across much of the northern border of Ukraine, and will it form part of the discussions at the NATO summit in Vilnius?
The honourable gentleman raised an important point about the role of Belarus. First of all, we should recognise that so far in this illegal invasion of Ukraine by Russia, Belarus has simply supported through the use of its bases, but it itself has committed no forces, and the international community would very clearly warn Belarus that it should not do so and join Russia on this folly that it is engaged in. It is, of course, a deep concern when we see Russia trying to use Belarus as a sort of satellite state, or indeed a place to put its nuclear weapons. We keep that under constant review, and we make sure in the strongest possible terms Belarus is aware of the international concerns around its behaviour.
Sir Michael Fabricant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The war in Ukraine will have given us some insight into Russia's war tactics. Now, the Defence Command White Paper will soon be published, I believe, and it'll be looking at investment decisions for the British Army and armed forces in general from the 2030s and beyond. What lessons have been learned from the war in Ukraine, and can you give us some insight into what sort of investment will be undertaken?
I can say to my right honourable friend that the Defence Command paper will be published before recess. I'm hoping it will be published sooner rather than later. It is currently in the position of write round to the rest of the government and make sure that we are recognising what's happened in Ukraine. One of the biggest lessons of Ukraine is whatever army you commit, you must make sure it is protected 360 degrees with air defence, electronic warfare, signals intelligence, and the ability to reach at range. If you just do numbers, you end up...
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In terms of aircraft carriers, it seems that the Prince of Wales is the spare. Why is it that ministers are struggling to manage the repairs of this vital NATO flagship?
Well, it's an amusing way of putting the question, but actually it's a serious point. Our plans actually have not been affected in operational terms, because it was always planned that Prince of Wales would return to flight trials this autumn, and that remains on schedule.
Sir Ian Duncan-Smith.
Mr. Speaker, to say to the Secretary of State, 40 years ago,
Sir Galahad was struck during the course of the Falklands crisis, and many, many Welsh Guardsmen lost their lives and burnt to death. I've just attended a meeting of the widows and the children and some of the veterans. They've been desperate to get to the bottom of exactly why this happened, and they've been blocked through no releases. I had to beg my right honourable friend to allow us, some colleagues across the floor, to come and see him about the release of that information.
My right honourable friend might like to know that former colleagues of mine from the Household Division, from the Welsh Guards and others have also been in contact with me. I have asked to see the papers that have not been released. I'm not sure what powers I have to overrule decisions that were made earlier, but I think it is important for closure and for relatives to get to the bottom of their questions.
Mr. Stevens.
ACVC Hub, Community Veterans Support, Helping Heroes, 3 wonderful charities helping veterans in Glasgow South West. With veterans' mental health still an emerging field, can I ask Ministers to consider providing a costed research and development plan to find innovative approaches to this vital research?
Well, I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman. He'll be aware of the range of mental health support services that are open to our veterans, in particular Op Courage, and he will be interested to note Op Fortitude. Of course, there's always more we can do, particularly for those who have suffered as a result of their service. But I think it's important to say that in general, service in our armed forces is a positive for mental health and not a negative.
James Sunderland.
Mr. Speaker, given the events over the weekend, and I accept we've got the FCDO statement in due course, what MOD assessment has been made of Ukraine's ability to win in Ukraine?
The United Kingdom has always been confident that given the right international support, the right leadership and the right investment, Ukraine can defend its nation and see off this aggressive, illegal Russian invasion.
Drew Hendry.
The Armed Forces Attitude Survey results have just been published, and they showed that less than a third of personnel believe that their basic pay is adequate. Nearly a quarter are looking to leave the forces. Will the Secretary of State admit that it's high time he increased basic pay across the public service, but especially for those in uniform?
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman. He'll be aware that the Armed Forces Pay Review Body has reported, and that will be released very shortly. Pay, of course, forms a part of a wider remuneration package, which includes an excellent non-contributory pension, subsidised accommodation, wraparound childcare, incremental pay, and a range of allowances. The non-financial aspects of the offer are also highly valued. What isn't highly valued, frankly, are the tax increases that the SNP put on in February, which makes servicemen in Scotland much worse off than they are in the rest of the United Kingdom.
Robert Ports. He's gone. Well, in which case, let's have Simon Jupp, who's a man on his feet.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Royal Marines charity based in East Devon helps provide support to former servicemen and women in Devon, who we celebrated on Saturday as part of Armed Forces Day. What assessment has my right honourable friend made of the welfare provision for veterans in Devon?
Grateful to my honourable friend. I'm sorry I wasn't in Devon on Saturday. I was next door in Cornwall, commemorating our armed forces like he was. Of course, there are a range of welfare support services in Devon. He'll be aware of the regional welfare support operation that we have there, with very expert welfare officers who can look after the needs of our wonderful veterans. Of course, we can always do more, but I would cite, as I just have done, Op Courage and now Op Fortitude, which I think will be of great assistance.
Owen Thompson.
Mr. Speaker, while we wait for the upcoming pay review, can I ask the Minister what assessment his department are making of terms of relative poverty amongst our service personnel? And while they await a significant and serious pay rise, what work they're doing with the Department for Work and Pensions to signpost colleagues to the benefits they're eligible for?
Grateful to the honourable gentleman. He will be aware that in addition to pay, open to our armed forces is things like wraparound childcare, subsidised healthcare, subsidised dental care. He'll be aware of subsidised accommodation, freezing of food charges, help with council tax, things that we have done in these difficult times to take the edge off the cost of living crisis, and I hope he'll welcome that.
David Moore.
Mr. Speaker, nowhere does venting as well as my Southport constituency in this weekend's Armed Forces Day was truly testament to that fact. So would my right honourable friend support and certainly welcome an application from Southport to host the National Armed Forces Day in 2025?
Mr. Speaker, can I place on record our gratitude to Falmouth, Cornwall Council and Falmouth and all the organisers of the National Armed Forces Day this year, an extraordinary event laid on by that town, and I think it was a great tribute to the men and women of the armed forces and all those other local authorities who laid on an event up and down the country. Of course, I would welcome a bid from Southport. I'll also welcome bids from all over the country. I look forward to the fact this is becoming a growing competition to recognise our men and women of our armed forces.
Alan Morgan.
Mr. Speaker, on the 24th of October 2021, the former Minister wrote to my predecessor in this role and confirmed that a badly injured veteran in my constituency would receive adaptations to his home. Delays ensued, and last week I had a meeting with the DIO in which he declined to turn his camera on and said that it hadn't been signed off by a person with the right authority. Could the Minister confirm whether the former Minister had the authority, and will he honour it?
Sorry, the Honourable Lady is more than welcome to write to me with the details. We'll look into it as soon as possible.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we've already heard, we were lucky enough to welcome the National Armed Forces family to Falmouth on Saturday for the National Armed Forces Day. From cadets to veterans and the air display and all the National Armed Forces personnel, I'd like to ask the Secretary of State whether he agrees with me in thanking everybody for their efforts that this was actually the best Armed Forces Day we've ever experienced.
Well, it's certainly the best MP for Falmouth, who's been very, very good at lobbying and making the case for Falmouth. And I'd certainly say Falmouth did an excellent event, but I'm not going to risk insulting all the previous nations who did a fantastic job as well.
Speaker, with MOD Estate an outlier in allowing trail hunting on its land and tearing up of the MOU of hunt monitoring access determined personally by the Defence Secretary, will he confirm that his delayed statutory response on terminating the MOU will be answered, and will he instruct an independent review of hunting on MOD Estate and the activities of the Royal Artillery Hunt, or has he something to hide?
Nothing to hide. To hunt on my department's land, an organisation must have a recognised governing body. All persons participating in a hunt must also be members of such an organisation. The organisation must also hold an MOD-issued licence. The terms which clearly state that only trail hunting carried out in accordance with the provisions of the Act are permitted. I withdrew the MOU that had never been announced to Parliament under her party's previous government, because the only people that should be masked and camouflaged on MOD land are soldiers in training and not hunt saboteurs.
Right, that completes questions. Right, we now come to the first of the statements. I call the Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Mr. Speaker, last week the Bank of England increased interest rates to 5% as the UK, like other countries, grapples with high inflation. We are steadfast in our support for the Independent Monetary Policy Committee as it takes whatever action necessary to return inflation to the 2% target in the medium term. Nonetheless, I know that higher inflation and interest rates cause anxiety and concern for many families. That's why the government is already supporting families with one of the largest support packages in Europe, worth £94 billion, or £3,300 per household on average. As interest rates rise, I will not take action that undermines the Bank of England's monetary objectives, but where there are non-inflationary measures we can take to relieve the anxiety faced by families, we will do so. That's why on Friday I met the UK's principal mortgage lenders alongside senior representatives from the Financial Conduct Authority and UK Finance to agree new support for people struggling with their mortgage payments. At that meeting I secured agreement from lenders to a new mortgage charter, which we're publishing today, that sets out what support customers will receive. It's been signed by lenders covering 85% of the UK market and provides support for two groups of people in particular. The first group are those who are worried about their mortgage repayments. If they want to switch to an interest-only mortgage or extend their mortgage term to reduce their monthly payments, they'll be able to do so with the option of switching back to their original mortgage deal within 6 months without any affordability check or credit score impact. For most people, the right course of action will be to continue to make payments on their current mortgage. This will always be the best option
and will always mean you pay less interest overall. But this new measure means that people will be able to opt for a lower cost approach for 6 months with full reversibility, giving people the peace of mind of knowing that they can try out a new approach and still change their minds later. This measure will take effect in the next few weeks and means that for a homeowner with a £200,000 property with a £100,000 outstanding on their mortgage over 15 years, they can change their payments with no immediate impact on their credit rating by extending the mortgage term by 10 years, which could save over £200 a month, or moving to interest-only payments, which could save over £350 a month. A further measure for this group of customers means that if they're approaching the end of a fixed-rate deal, they'll be offered the chance to lock in a new deal with the same lender up to 6 months ahead. However, they'll still be able to apply for a better like-for-like deal with the same lender with no penalty if they find one until their current deal ends. This will provide people with more flexibility and optionality to find the best deal for their circumstances. The second group of people we are supporting are those who are at real risk of losing their homes because they fall behind in their mortgage payments. Mortgage arrears and defaults remain at historically low levels, with under 1% of residential mortgages in arrears in 2023, and at a lower level than just before the pandemic. Nonetheless, for the families involved, it is extraordinarily distressing to lose your house. So we want to do all we can to support people who find themselves in such a challenging financial position. As part of our strong regulatory framework for mortgage holders, banks and lenders already provide tailored support for anyone struggling and deploy highly trained staff to help such customers. Support offered includes temporary payment deferrals, part interest, part repayment, as well as extending mortgage terms or switching to interest-only payments. To supplement that, we've agreed as part of the mortgage charter that in the extreme situation in which a lender is seeking to repossess a home, there will be a minimum 12-month period from the first missed payment before there is a repossession without consent. And anyone at all who is worried they could be in this situation should know they can call their lender for advice without any impact whatsoever on their credit score. Lenders will also provide support to customers who are up to date with payments to switch to a new mortgage deal at the end of their existing fixed-rate deal without another affordability test, and provide well-timed information when their current rate is coming to an end. Taken together, these measures should offer comfort to those who are anxious about the impact of higher interest rates on their mortgages and provide support to those who do get into any extreme financial difficulties. The mortgage market itself remains robust, and the average homeowner remortgaging over the last year had close to 50% loan to value, indicating most people have considerable equity in their homes. Mr. Speaker, tackling inflation is the Prime Minister and my #1 priority. We said we would halve inflation, not because it was an easy thing to do, but because it is the right thing to do. And we won't flinch in our resolve, because we know getting rid of high inflation from our economy is the only way that we can ultimately relieve pressure on family finances and on businesses. And that is why we will seek to remove inflationary pressures in our economy and not stoke them. That is what the measures I have set out today will help to do, and I commend this statement to the House.
Now come to the Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I would like to thank the Chancellor for advance sight of his statement this afternoon. Families are worried sick to their stomach about what is happening at the moment, but the Prime Minister says, don't worry, it will all be okay. But it's not going to be okay for the millions of homeowners who face an average increase of mortgage costs this year of £2,900. And all of this during a wider cost of living crisis. Now, the Prime Minister told the country yesterday to hold its nerve. But where are people supposed to find the money in the meantime to pay for the Tory mortgage bombshell? The Chancellor and the Prime Minister have not yet said. For many, the Tory mortgage bombshell will mean holidays cancelled, families' savings draining away and missing out on days spent with family and friends. but for others it could be much worse. Not moving up the housing ladder, but heading down it through no fault of their own. The Chancellor doesn't need to take my word about how many people will be facing the Tory mortgage bombshell. He could speak to any of the 11,600 families in his own constituency who will be paying £450 more every month in mortgage costs alone as a result of this Conservative government. The Resolution Foundation estimate that millions of households will have to pay a combined total of £15.8 billion more in mortgage payments a year by 2026. That is just devastating. The Tories gambled last autumn with people's livelihoods, and since then things have got worse, not better. Yet ministers take no responsibility for the damage that they have caused and blame anything and everyone else. Yet again today, the government claims that there are global factors, that it's all global factors, yet the latest data show that a typical household in Britain is now paying over £2,000 more per year for their mortgage than in France, over £1,000 more per year than in Ireland or Belgium, and over £800 per year more than in Germany. Now, the Chancellor is going to need a better scapegoat. Labour set out our plans last week. Our measures were a requirement. Yes, a requirement. Because all lenders need to play their part when people are struggling. Our plan would have provided real help, but government have provided just a bad cover version. While many banks and building societies are doing the right thing by their customers, a voluntary set of measures is just not good enough. The Chancellor today said that the voluntary measures would cover 85% of the mortgage market. What is his answer for the more than 1 million families who are missing out because their lender hasn't signed up to this scheme? Tough luck? Just how bad does it have to get before the Chancellor recognises that mandatory action is needed to provide meaningful assistance? So I would like to ask the Chancellor the following questions. Can he confirm what consequences there are for firms who have not signed up to this scheme? Where is the plan for renters, who the Chancellor didn't even mention in his statement today, many of whom are paying higher rents because the mortgage costs of their landlords have gone up? Why does the Chancellor think that savers are not enjoying the full benefits from rising interest rates in the same way that mortgage holders are feeling the full pain? Why does the Chancellor think that the UK has the highest inflation in the G7? And does he still think the government is on track with its own target of halving inflation by the end of the year? How does the Chancellor think that getting rid of house building targets will help increase home ownership? And finally, Mr. Speaker, 6 days ago, the Chancellor said in this House that he was proud of the government's economic record. With energy bills twice as high as they were last year, with food inflation close to 20%, and with millions hit by the Tory mortgage bombshell, is he seriously saying that he is proud of that record? Mr. Speaker, people work hard to get on the housing ladder, yet dreams now risk becoming nightmares due to the decisions of this Conservative government. The Chancellor today has come to the House with a watered-down package that does not meet the task of dealing with the Tory mortgage bombshell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'll deal with her specific points first. She says these measures should be mandatory. So why did Labour oppose the intervention power in the Financial Services and Markets Bill that would have made that possible? She said that she wants action for savers, and I have indeed been talking to banks about action for savers, and we will keep the House updated. But what she carefully did not mention is that we actually secured on Friday more than Labour committed to, because our measures provide protection for people missing for payments, not for 6 months, but for 12 months. But the main point, Mr. Speaker, is that she wants people to think that she is fiscally responsible. She won't take risks with inflation. So why on earth is she committed to borrowing £28 billion a year more, when as a former Bank of England economist she should know that will be inflationary and push up the cost of mortgages? Don't listen to me. Mr. Speaker, listen to people like Paul Johnson of the IFS, who said about Labour's plans, and I quote, "Additional borrowing both pumps more money into the economy, potentially," and she may not want to hear this, this is what Paul Johnson says about Labour's plans. Quite, additional borrowing both pumps more money into the economy, potentially increasing inflation, and also drives up interest rates. It's Labour's mortgage bombshell, hidden in plain sight. Isn't the reason she doesn't want people is that she doesn't want people to notice the real comparison here, which is that her party faced an economic crisis in 2008, just as this government did last year. The difference is that we are taking the difficult decisions to restore sound money and public finances. They ducked each and every one of those decisions, ran out of money and left it to others to clear up the mess.
Sir John Redwood.
Given that we don't want too much pressure on mortgage holders who will be struggling, will the government launch a series of supply-side measures to increase supply of things that are short, to promote more homegrown food and more home-produced energy, and above all, to work with public sector employees and managers to have a productivity revolution in the public services where there's been a collapse in output?
Well, as so often, my right honourable friend is absolutely right, and it is in supply-side measures that we see the long-term solution to the inflation problem that we and many other countries face. That is why the budget was focused on labour supply measures such as a massive reduction in the cost of childcare, up to 60% cost in the reduction of childcare for families with young children, and it's why my right honourable friend, the Chief Secretary of the Treasury, is launching the very productivity review that my friend has called for many times to make sure we're getting better value for money out of public money spent.
Spokesperson Stuart Hulls.
Mr. Speaker, I think with a debt to GDP ratio at 100%, the Chancellor was rather brave to talk about sound money. However, can I welcome this statement and early sight of it, notwithstanding it was described by Reuters as a package of limited relief measures. It is nonetheless necessary and welcome. Support from lenders, no repossession within 12 months of a missed payment, the chance to lock in a deal 6 months early, a temporary move to interest only, and no impact on customer credit scores. Can I also say I think his words about anxiety and concern were the right tone, unlike his Prime Minister yesterday. However, that doesn't begin to answer some of the fundamental questions. Given the base rate drives the mortgage rate, and the base rate, as the Chancellor knows, is the primary tool the bank has to tackle rising inflation, is this now not the time to review the Bank of England's targets and tools? Secondly, is the government genuinely convinced that using a rising base rate to tackle input inflation caused by external shocks, is that really the best approach we have, other than to tip the economy into recession, which some people are actually suggesting, which I hope the Chancellor would agree would be a quite idiotic and catastrophic thing to do? And thirdly and finally, Mr. Speaker, should we now not revert to forward guidance on base rates from the Bank of England as we had under Mark Carney during the financial crisis? It may not affect the trajectory of interest rates and mortgage rates initially, although it might, but it would certainly provide certainty to business, retail and mortgage borrowers.
Well, I often don't agree with what the honourable gentleman says, but I actually thank him for the constructive tone of his comments this afternoon, because he is absolutely right to talk about external shocks. And he will know, as we do, that interest rates have gone up by similar amounts in the United States, Canada, Australia and New Zealand, and that core inflation is actually higher in 14 EU countries. So we need to look at all the tools at our disposal. I think whether the Bank of England Governor issues forward guidance is a matter for the Governor, but I'm sure the Governor will have heard his comments, and I think that it's important, because we respect and support the independence of the Bank of England, that I allow him to make those judgments. But I would disagree with him in terms of his suggestion about reviewing the target for inflation. I think that target is the right target, and I think it's very important that we give everyone confidence of our total commitment to hit that target, which we will.
Sir Desmond Swain.
Given the significant tightening in the measures of monetary growth, is he absolutely sure that the Bank of England has got it right?
Chancellor.
Well, the Bank of England governor himself has been very open about the fact that their inflation forecasting has not been accurate, and they are conducting an independent review to see how they can do it better. So, you know, it's clear that there have been some issues with the way that process has worked. But what I would say to him in all... Mr. Speaker, you're absolutely correct to correct me on that point. So what I would say to you, Mr. Speaker, about the point raised is simply that I think in my dealings with the Bank of England, I have never once had any reason to question their resolve to hit the target, but we need to make sure the forecasting is better.
Dame Angela Riedel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. 8,600 families in Wallasey are facing increases in their mortgage bills of up to £1,800 in a year, a huge extra chunk of worry. So I welcome the Chancellor's statement, but doesn't he worry that the banks are being very slow to pass on interest rate rises to those who are saving, whilst they are passing almost immediately interest rate rises on to those who borrow, which makes the interest rate mechanism much less effective in dealing with the inflation situation? And did he notice, like I did, that the banks this quarter made over £4 billion extra on the differential between these? So shouldn't he have been much tougher on the banks? And what is he going to do to stop this profiteering?
Chancellor.
Well, the Right Honourable Lady is absolutely right. It is taking too long for the increases in interest rates to be passed on to savers, particularly with instant access accounts. The rates are more frequently being passed on to people who have fixed-term, fixed-notice accounts. But she's right, there is an issue there. I raised that issue in no uncertain terms with the banks when I met them, and I'm working on a solution because I think it is an issue that needs resolving.
Sir Bill Wigton.
My right honourable friend will know that increasing liquidity in the housing market will give homeowners more options and choices. Will he look at reducing the burden of stamp duty so that he will help homeowners both current and future?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his comment. The level of stamp duty is something that, as with all taxation measures, is kept under review, and we make decisions at the time of fiscal events, whether autumn statements or spring budgets, and we'll continue to do that.
Sir Aldy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The root cause of soaring interest rates, other than the shambles of the mini-budget, is this government's failure to control inflation, which the Prime Minister took personal responsibility for to halve inflation this year. So will he explain why this government is refusing to take obvious steps to tackle inflation, like reinstating energy support for farmers and businesses, cutting import costs for small businesses, and bringing down the NHS waiting list to alleviate the squeeze on our workforce?
Chancellor.
I find it strange that she should be criticising the government's failure to tackle inflation when her party is supporting a multi-billion-pound package of mortgage support that would increase inflation. And I have to say, they are positioning themselves brilliantly as the pro-inflation party.
Mark Pritchard.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the new mortgage charter, but can I say with all members from across the House that constituents are suffering. They are very concerned. Many are having to choose between food, clothes, shoes, and paying the mortgage or paying the rent. And decisions that we make here, either as a governing party or cross-party, are having a direct impact on individuals' lives every single day. So can I join cross-party with the Honourable Member for Wallasey and say she is absolutely right that so often when the base rate rises, lenders are very quick to raise those interest rates on our constituents. But when they fall, and they surely will fall, and hopefully very soon, possibly in the autumn, we'll see. Can my right honourable friend make sure that those reductions are passed on as quickly as possible to our constituents?
Chancellor.
Well, my honourable friend is right to draw attention to the human consequences in any economic shock. And I am extremely proud that under this government since 2010, 1.7 million people have been lifted out of absolute poverty, including 400,000 children. And that is why in the autumn statement we prioritised giving help to people facing the biggest challenges with a £94 billion package of support to help people through the cost of living crisis. But one thing that can definitely happen better than it is now is passing on increases in the base rate to savers.
Doherty.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the reasons why nearly 10,000 of my constituents in Cardiff South and Penarth are going to be hit by the Tory mortgage bombshell is that, of course, many of the deals which are coming to an end in this 12-month period were taken out when interest rates were below 2%. They're now at 5%. Will the Chancellor set out clearly what his private analysis is of the likely rises in arrears and repossessions over the next few months?
I don't have any private forecasts that I haven't shared with the House. What I can say is that they're currently about 0.9% of families with mortgages are in arrears, and that is nearly 4 times less than it was in 2009.
Anna Firth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Chancellor for his statement, and a third of my constituents have mortgages and will welcome this range of measures. But now that the majority of the mortgage market is predominantly fixed, not floating, would he agree that rising short-term interest rates will not necessarily result in falling inflation, and that we do need to look at other measures, and such as making sure that interest rates are passed on to savers so that they keep their money in the bank?
She's absolutely right. I mean, it is still the case that, notwithstanding the fact that 85% of mortgages now are fixed to some degree, there will be an extra 1.2 million people who will feel these, 1.2 million families who will feel the increase in interest rates over the months between now and the end of this year. So it will be felt by many, many families, but we should do everything within our power to tackle inflation, because in the end, that is the only way to end the misery for so many people.
Richard Beck.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many of the banks that the Chancellor's been talking about are raking in bumper profits by refusing to pass on higher interest rates to their savers. Surely a windfall tax on these additional profits would allow the government to provide mortgage holders with the kind of support that they really need at this time. And before the Chancellor dismisses this idea, can I gently remind the Chancellor that even Margaret Thatcher imposed such a windfall tax on banks' excess profits?
Well, I hear what the honourable gentleman says, but he'll be pleased to know that banks already pay a surcharge on their corporation tax of 3%. That means they pay 3% more than everyone else, as well as a levy on their balance sheets.
Philip Oliver.
Welcome the action the Chancellor has taken on this issue. Effectively increasing the flexibility of mortgage terms and conditions will provide much welcome relief to homeowners who are really struggling with anxiety at this present time. The mortgage charter sounds great. What obligations has he insisted with the mortgage companies on getting this information out to mortgage holders to inform them of the extra flexibility in the mortgages that are available?
Chancellor.
Well, my honourable friend makes a very good point, and a number of lenders, in fact all lenders, had some of these measures to a lesser or greater extent. But what is significant about Friday is that they've basically aligned their offer so that it is much easier to communicate, which means that all families with mortgages, and this charter has been agreed to by 85% of the market, so very, very large majority of mortgage lenders, are agreeing to a simple set of terms that they will all follow, so it's easy for people to understand what their rights are.
Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The people watching this who have too much month at the end of their money need better straight answers from the Chancellor. He's ducked the question about whether he actually thinks the government is going to reach its own targets on halving inflation. He needs to be honest about what he thinks the consequences of only reaching an inflation target of 5% will be. And actually, I join with colleagues across the House who've raised concerns about the fact the vast majority of mortgages are fixed mortgages. People facing the possibility of eviction, even a year's time, will be sick with worry.
What assessment has he made if inflation only gets to 5% of the impact? And when will he learn the lessons of the energy companies and not wait until we hold the banks responsible for their role in all of this?
Chancellor.
Well, with the greatest respect to the Honourable Lady, who I do in fact have a lot of respect for, I think she is being a little bit churlish in her approach as to what the government has done, because I haven't waited. I actually called in the banks and the lenders on Friday, and I got them to commit to a set of terms that will make life easier for 85% of families with mortgages if their mortgage comes up for renewal. And with respect to the government's target to halve inflation, both the Bank of England and the International Monetary Fund have said they believe we are on track.
David Simmons.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've never forgotten the anxiety that was caused to my parents in the late 1980s after they bought their current home and interest rates soared. But does my right honourable friend agree with me that the package of measures which he has announced will help enormously to alleviate the anxiety which many households are feeling without allowing rampant inflation to put my constituents' dreams of home ownership even further out of reach?
Chancellor.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for a very thoughtful question, and I do think that the measures agreed to by the banks and principal lenders on Friday will make a big difference. And in particular, for people who are genuinely in arrears, they know that their house will not be forcibly repossessed for 12 months. That is a very important piece of reassurance. It gives people longer to get their finances in order. And I think it also particularly encourages people who are worried about the impact of their credit score, that the simple fact of having a conversation if you're in distress won't have any impact on that credit score. So I hope that means for people like his parents were that this is an important set of measures.
Brendan O'Hara.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In his statement, the Chancellor said there will be a minimum 12-month period in the first missed payment before a repossession without consent. Does this start or come into effect from today, or will this be applied retrospectively? And what would that mean for hard-pressed families who, because of soaring mortgage costs, say they missed August, but they managed to pay September, October, November, December, but missed January? At what point does the clock start ticking on their repossession?
Well, this is an agreement that will take effect in the next few weeks, but the context of the agreement that was made with the banks and lenders is one where they are agreeing to do everything they possibly can to give people longer to get their affairs in order so that repossessions are reduced or eliminated altogether. So I think this will be a positive step forward.
Siobhan Bailey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I listened really carefully to the Shadow Chancellor because I want to hear serious ideas. The public are not daft. They can see there is incredible pressures across the world. But not only are they coming up with ideas, also breaking their own economic pledges. And it made me think of the latest Labour councillor to step down, who said recently she watched Keir Starmer's leadership with increasing concern and frustration because it's seeing the lack of policy to help those most affected with the cost of living. Does my right honourable friend agree with me? Will he say more about how we can keep working with the lenders so it's not just a one-off conversation that he's had, to create solutions to help some of the problems ahead of us?
Chancellor.
I'm happy to give her that reassurance. I will continue to talk not only to the lenders but also to regulators who I'm meeting later this week to see if there are any areas at all where price reductions that should be passed on to consumers are not being done so, and I hope to update the House further.
Debbie Abraham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll put aside the fact that the Chancellor didn't answer my right honourable friend in terms of what happens to the million people that are outside the 85% of mortgage providers as far as this is concerned, or why we have higher borrowing costs than France, Germany and Ireland. 9,200 homes, families are affected by the increase in interest rates and the mortgages that they're going to be paid. Voluntary codes have a limited impact. We know, for example, from the prompt payment code. So who is going to be actually monitoring the compliance of the code, and how many people will have to be disappointed by their lender before the Chancellor put this into a statutory form.
Chancellor.
It's generous of her to put aside so many things. I'll also put aside the fact that Labour opposed the powers that would have meant mandatory imposition of this charter on the banks and lenders would have been possible. But what I would say to her is that the charter we have will be monitored by the Financial Conduct Authority, and they will take appropriate action if they think that banks and lenders are in breach of their statutory duties.
Jane Hunt.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I recently met with constituents in the Wolds villages who have shared ownership arrangements for their properties with a housing association. They've never actually missed a payment. Please can my right honourable friend confirm that the Mortgage Charter will assist those with shared ownership schemes across the country?
Chancellor.
I'm absolutely delighted to give that confirmation.
Liz Saville-Roberts.
During the 2008 credit crunch, Plaid Cymru developed a mortgage rescue scheme as part of the One Wales government. Through the cooperation agreement, we've now secured £40 million to support Welsh mortgage holders in difficulty, and people look to government to help them keep their homes in a crisis. Will you follow where Plaid Cymru led and implement direct protections for those hardest hit by interest rate increases?
Chancellor.
We will do everything we possibly can to help people in difficulties, except measures that themselves are inflationary.
Walker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the fact that my right honourable friend, in tackling this huge challenge, is determined not to increase inflation. He recognised, though, that with so many people owning their properties outright and not having a mortgage on them today, actually increasing the payment for people who save is a very important element to tackling inflation. Can I wish him every success in his further conversations to encourage the banks to pass on interest rates to savers?
He is absolutely right. If more people are encouraged to save, that is technically counter-inflationary and is something to be encouraged.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, due to the disastrous policies of Conservative governments, including eventually crashing the economy, hard-working Brits, including people in my Slough constituency, are having to pay the price via painful premiums on their mortgage or rent. But why specifically does the Chancellor think that the latest data shows that someone with a £200,000 loan is paying over £800 more annually in the UK than in Germany and over £2,000 more than somebody in France?
Yeah, good.
Chancellor.
What I would say to him, if he wants to look at Europe, he would see that 14 EU countries have higher core inflation than we do here. And in terms of interest rate rises, they've been at similar levels in Australia, New Zealand, Canada and the United States.
Simon Fell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank my right honourable friend for his statement and his hard work in securing this new mortgage charter. It provides certainty and comfort for people in globally uncertain times. The simplification of the terms, the coverage of 85% of the market is welcome. I wonder whether he can speak to his views on the 15% of the market who aren't round the table at the moment, and also what message he should be sending to their customers.
Chancellor.
Well, we will be making big efforts to sign up any remaining lenders who have not signed up to the Charter, to get, I think, to 85% over the period of 4 days is a good start. We'd love to get the other 15% on board, but what I would say is that if they're not on board, that will make their mortgage offer less competitive to many thousands of families who will be looking to sign up for their new mortgage with someone who does take efforts to reduce the anxiety they may feel.
Justin Mammons.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituents who are facing eye-watering increases in their mortgage repayments are asking, as other members have, how they can square that with the increased profits the banks and building societies are making. But they're also asking whether this pain is for any gain. Inflation has not come down in the way that was hoped from the government. And is it the case that the mortgage market is now fundamentally different to what it was like in the early 90s, last time we had spiralling interest rates, and whether this tool is actually just hammering a group of people and not actually tackling the core problem? So I just asked the Chancellor whether he believes there is an element of truth in that, and whether there are other tools that there are at its disposal to actually get inflation down.
Chancellor.
I think he's absolutely right to say that the mortgage market has changed, with 85% of deals now having an element of fixed rate in them. But I still think interest rates are the most effective tool, and I would say that other countries have used interest rates and are seeing their inflation starting to fall, and I would expect it to do so here.
Alison Thewlis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The reality is that this mortgage crisis is not the only crisis that this government is presiding over. Step Change, the debt charity, have found that 45% of mortgage holders, some 7 million of them, are now struggling to keep up with all their other bills following the rise in interest rates. So can I ask the Chancellor, what conversations is he having with those companies providing other forms of consumer credit and with debt advice charities who are providing support on the front line to many people who have never had to call on their services before?
Chancellor.
Well, we continue to have conversations with everyone who's involved in relieving families who are in distress because of debt arrears, whatever they are. But I think the most important help we can give people is the cost of living support, the decision to extend the energy price guarantee, which has reduced people's electricity bills and meant overall we paid about half people's electricity bills over the last year.
Paula Barker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, the Bank of England confirmed that the rise in rates has been worse here in the UK, with overnight swaps the key driver of mortgage rates rising more than twice as much in the UK than in the USA. What assessment has the Chancellor and his department made of the reasons why the UK has been much worse hit than elsewhere? And will he finally admit that this is the case? And would the Chancellor just indulge me in explaining the difference between poverty and his new catchphrase of absolute poverty?
Chancellor.
She may want to belittle the fact that there are 400,000 more children out of absolute poverty, 200,000 pensioners. I think it's a very important achievement and I'm very proud of it. But I also think she should recognise that the primary cause of the inflation that we're seeing is international factors that has affected very many other countries, which is why we are seeing interest rates rise across the world.
Shelby Perkins.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It is the 8,600 mortgage holders in Chesterfield who've seen their mortgage increase by an average of £1,900 a year will be very much conscious that in the Chancellor's response, he's very happy to blame global factors. But when he's asked about those specific countries, like France, like Germany, the major European nations, where the outcomes are not as bad as they are here in the UK, he quickly deflects and says, well, I'd like to talk about Australia or Canada. Will he answer the question that my honourable friend from Leeds West has asked and explain why it is worse for constituents of mine in Chesterfield than it is in France, than it is in Germany, and that it is in other countries that he's been asked about?
I mean, the truth is that you can pick countries in Europe where things have not been as severe as here, but you can pick countries in Europe where they've been more severe, such as the 14 EU countries which have got higher core inflation.
Bill Esterson.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. He's not going to get off with not answering that question. Yeah. We're going to keep asking him again and again until he answers. Why is it that people are paying £800 less in Germany than here, £1,000 less in Ireland and Belgium than here, and £2,000 less in France than here? What is it that their governments, their economies are doing differently? Or is it just that they don't have the problem of 13 years of this Tory government that's behind it?
Chancellor.
Well, let me give the same answer that I gave to his honourable friend. Core inflation is higher in more than half EU countries, so it isn't just about us.
Beth Winter.
We've had 13 interest rate rises in a row, yet little help for those in housing need, and 13 years of public sector pay cuts, and that's all the Tory government has done is to double down on more real-term pay cuts. When is this government going to take action to tackle the cost of living crisis by raising incomes? And having bailed out the banks in 2008-2009 to the tune of hundreds of billions of pounds, shouldn't the government now not deal with the causes of inflation by controlling bank profiteering and redistributing the extreme wealth that exists to those millions of people, including those in my constituency, Cynon Valley, who are suffering and are at serious risk and are petrified of losing their homes through no fault of their own?
Chancellor.
Well, she is absolutely right to be concerned about families in her constituency, as we all are in our constituencies, who are worried about the impact of rising interest rates on their mortgage repayments. She is wrong to suggest that this government has not been extremely generous in its cost of living payments, which at £94 billion are more actually than her party was calling for. And if she wants to talk about the last 13 years, maybe she should reflect why a Conservative-led government was elected in 2010. It was to pick up the pieces of a terrible economic mess that her party left behind.
Chris Stevens.
Mr. Speaker, citizens of East Scotland have reported that requests for advice from people who were homeless or at risk of homelessness has reached its highest ever level in May this year and was up 30% from May 2022. So what additional measures does the Chancellor plan to protect the most vulnerable households from the impact of soaring interest rates on their mortgage repayments?
Chancellor.
Well, let me tell him what we've done for those families. For families on means-tested benefits, this year they'll get a payment of £900. For pensioner families, they will get a payment of £300, and for families with someone disabled, they'll get an extra payment of £150, alongside a lot of other measures.
Alex Cunningham.
Mr. Speaker, two of my constituents face a near tripling of their mortgage payments to over £2,600 a month. Now, it's easy for me to talk about the Tory mortgage bombshell and rightly blame the government for crashing the economy. But what does the Chancellor have to say to my constituents? And why do they have to pick up the bill for government incompetence?
Chancellor.
What I would say to his constituents is that we are taking the difficult decisions to deal with inflation in this country as other countries are with inflation in their countries, and we will do what it takes, because dealing with inflation is the only way in the long run we can stop more families going through what those constituents are that he referred to.
Helen Morgan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have constituents whose mortgages were with Northern Rock when it collapsed back in 2008, and they've been moved against their will to inactive lenders who've not allowed them to remortgage onto fixed rates. They're now trapped paying variable rates for a long period of time, and they will continue to be so going forward. Is there any help for mortgage prisoners in the measures that the Chancellor has announced today?
Well, she raises a very fair point, and I will write to her with some details of what we're thinking in that area.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When mortgages go up, private rent goes up, and yet the local housing allowance disparity is growing faster in places like York than anywhere in the country. So what process is he set in train to review the local housing allowance, but also the broad rented market area, which is out of kilter in places like York compared to the surrounding area?
Chancellor.
Well, she's absolutely right to talk about the impact on renters because of the high prevalence of right-to-let landlords and the pass-through effect. And that is an area we're looking at in a great deal of detail, and I will write to her with some of the things that we're looking at and planning to do.
Martin Doherty.
Let's quote the Chancellor in his statement, Mr. Speaker. This new measures means that people will be able to opt for a lower cost approach for 6 months with full reversibility, giving people the peace of mind knowing they can try out a new approach and still change their minds later. So let's go back to the issue of mortgage prisoners. Why doesn't he know about the assistance that his Chancellorship, his Chancellor of the Exchequer, is not able to give him? Why doesn't he have an answer to that question, given the statement he just gave?
Chancellor.
It is a very complicated issue, and I've said I will write to the Honourable Lady. I'm happy to write to the Honourable Gentleman, but if he's saying, are we doing nothing to help people struggling and worried about mortgage repayments, I would just urge him to read the statement in full.
Jonathan Edwards.
Mr. Speaker. The so-called mortgage time bomb will hit younger generations in particular. So what fiscal measures is he considering to help younger generations and to address the financial intergenerational unfairness that exists in the UK?
Well, you know, he is right to draw attention to that issue, and I would simply say that the biggest measure in the spring budget was childcare measures, which will mean that families with young children can get up to £6,500 of help with their childcare costs to help them go back to work. That will help those families, but will also help tackle inflation.
And finally, Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I first of all thank the Chancellor very much for his statement today and for the very clear help that the Chancellor is trying to give. So I very much welcome the move to ensure that in the extreme situation of a repossession that there will be a minimum of 12 months for the first missed payment. But can the Chancellor confirm if this is from any first missed payment or from a specific time, considering that there may be those who missed a payment, for instance, say 5 months ago, and none since, but who have lost a job or are ill? Will this extension and the compassion be taken if more than one payment is missed within the last year? And how will the Chancellor ensure that his goal of giving people time in exceptional circumstances is not circumvented by those banks and others?
Chancellor.
Well, he is absolutely right to raise that issue, and I want to reassure him that banks are required by the FCA for people who get into arrears to offer them a tailored solution specific to their particular circumstances in order to make sure that precisely the kind of thing that he worries about won't happen.
That completes that statement. I'll let the chamber clear before they start the next statement. We now come to the next statement. I call the Foreign Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I will update the House on the situation in Russia. The long-running feud played out in public between Yevgeny Prigozhin and his Wagner group and the leaders of the Russian armed forces reached a peak over the weekend. On the 10th of June, Russia's Deputy Defence Minister said that volunteers fighting for Russia must sign contracts with the Russian Ministry of Defence by the 1st of July. Prigozhin announced immediately that his personnel would refuse to do so. We, along no doubt with many members of this House, had been following closely the open escalation of rhetoric from Prigozhin. Last Friday, Prigozhin denounced Russia's military leadership, accusing them of bringing evil on the country and invading Ukraine for their own personal benefit. He drove a coach and horses through President Putin's case for war, saying, and I quote, "The war was needed for Shoigu to receive a hero star. The oligarch clan that rules Russia needed a war." He then went on to add, and I stress I quote him directly here, "The mentally ill scumbags decided it's okay, we'll throw in a few thousand more Russian men as cannon fodder. They'll die under artillery fire, but we'll get what we want." In the early hours of Saturday, Wagner forces entered the city of Rostov-on-Don in southern Russia, and Prigozhin announced that he would march on Moscow. This finally drew a response from Putin, who accused Prigozhin of an armed rebellion and promised tough action and punishment. Wagner troops promptly advanced more than 500 miles northwards towards Moscow before Prigozhin abruptly called off his operation and announced that Wagner would return to their bases. Having condemned him as a traitor in the morning, Putin pardoned Prigozhin in the afternoon, when a Kremlin spokesman announced that no charges would be brought. Mr. Speaker, the government, of course, considers this an internal Russian affair, and of course, the leadership of Russia is a matter exclusively for the Russian people. But everybody should note that one of Putin's protégés had publicly destroyed his case for the war in Ukraine. Prigozhin said on Friday there was nothing out of the ordinary before the 24th of February 2022. The situation was frozen with exchanges of military action and vicious looting by the Russians. He also said that Russia's defense ministry is trying to deceive both the president and the nation, that there was incredible aggression from the Ukrainian side with NATO support ready to attack Russia. The Russian government's lies have been exposed by one of President Putin's own henchmen. Now, the full story of this weekend's events and the long-term effects will take some time to become clear, and it is not helpful to speculate. Prigozhin's rebellion is an unprecedented challenge to President Putin's authority, and it is clear that cracks are emerging in the Russian support for the war. I, of course, hold no candle for Prigozhin or his forces. They have committed atrocities in Ukraine and elsewhere, But he has said out loud what we have believed since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion, that this invasion was both unjustified and unprovoked. The events of this weekend are an unprecedented challenge to Putin's authority, with an armoured column approaching his own capital city. As the situation unfolded, the government monitored and responded to developments carefully. I was briefed on Friday evening and again regularly throughout the weekend by my officials. On Saturday, I chaired a COBRA meeting on the situation. We also have been in close contact with our allies. On Saturday, I spoke with Secretary Blinken and my other G7 colleagues, and I've also been in touch with other regional partners. My right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, spoke with President Biden, President Macron and Chancellor Scholz on Saturday afternoon. Mr. Speaker, despite these internal developments in Russia, Putin's bloody war in Ukraine continues. The Ukrainians fight for their survival, and our Ukrainian friends are mounting a determined counteroffensive and steadily clawing back their territory. We will not be distracted from our work to support Ukraine's self-defence and their subsequent recovery. This weekend's events show that it is Ukraine and its partners, not Russia, that have the strategic patience and resolve to prevail. At last week's Ukraine Recovery Conference, we sent a clear message that not only will we stand by our Ukrainian friends as they resist Putin's onslaught, but we will stand with them in the subsequent peace as well. Now that Russia's leadership cannot justify this war, even to each other, the only rightful course is for Putin to withdraw his troops and end this bloodshed now. Mr. Speaker, I commend this statement to the House.
Senate Foreign Secretary David Lammy.
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I start by thanking the Foreign Secretary for being in touch over the weekend and for the Government for providing briefings on Privy Council terms to Her Majesty's official opposition. Our greatest strength in support of Ukraine and against Putin's invasion is our unity. With this in mind, we are reassured to hear that the Government has been working closely with our allies and partners around the world. Can I ask if the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary have spoken to their counterparts in Ukraine today or over the weekend to reiterate to Ukraine that all sides of this House are in for the long haul and that the UK will always support them in their fight for democracy over tyranny? The events that unfolded shone a light on serious problems in Russia. Prigozhin has been a long time and close ally of Putin. His military company, the Wagner Group, started becoming involved in eastern Ukraine in 2014. He is not only the owner of Wagner, but also has a media empire that has been involved in hybrid campaigns around the world. It's staggering that Prigozhin publicly challenged not only Putin's leadership, but the false narrative Putin used to justify his full-scale invasion, challenging the lie that Ukraine or NATO posed a threat to Russia, and stating clearly what we all know, that Putin's full-scale invasion is failing on its own terms. It showed that the reality and costs of the war that Putin is trying to suppress are coming back to haunt him. The opposition agrees it's not helpful to speculate about where this will end up in the long term, because this is a puzzle that is constantly shifting in size and shape, but it raises many questions about the here and now. As well as in Ukraine, the Wagner Group has been responsible for atrocities in Syria and right across the continent of Africa. This side of the House has long called for the proscription of a terrorist organisation. We may have seen the end of the Wagner Group in its first iteration, but what does the Foreign Secretary know about where it leaves its future? What was Prigozhin offered that led him to run back just 200 kilometres from Moscow? Will Prigozhin now disappear into obscurity following his denunciation of the lies behind the conduct of Russia's aggression in Ukraine, or could this pose a new threat to Ukraine from Belarus? And will Wagner troops continue to sow the seeds of violence and discord around the world as a private militia or as part of the regular Russian military? The most important effects of this weekend's chaos will be on the bloody conflict on our continent. Mr. Speaker, as Secretary Blinken has said, last February, Russian forces were approaching Kyiv thinking they'd be able to capture the capital in just a few days. 1 year and 4 months on, Russia has had to defend Moscow from the internal rebellion. What happens in Russia is a matter, of course, for Russia. But one thing remains completely certain. The security of our continent depends on Ukraine winning this war. I commend the Foreign Secretary for hosting the Ukraine Recovery Conference in London last week. Following discussions with foreign ministers, is he confident that Ukraine will get the military, economic, diplomatic and humanitarian support it needs in the months ahead? And when are we going to get on with not just freezing, but seizing Russian state assets, as our Opposition Day debate calls for tomorrow? And how does the government plan to use its diplomacy to galvanise support for Ukraine among a wider global coalition of countries that include the global south, many of whom have maintained a neutral stance? We must maintain the depth of support for Ukraine here in the UK, but amongst our allies and partners. We must also grow in its breadth, so that Putin has no choice but to withdraw his troops, so that Ukraine wins, and so that the Ukrainian people get the freedom and justice they deserve.
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Right Honourable Gentleman raises a number of very important points, and he asks questions that, of course, we and our allies are asking about what situations may evolve as a direct repercussion of this very public attack on Putin's authority by one of his protégés and closest allies. I'm not comfortable with speculating, but as I'm sure he will understand, analysts within my department and others will look at potential scenarios and ensure that we have mitigations in place if appropriate. And of course, he makes the very important point that Wagner Group are not only operating in Ukraine, but in many other parts of the world, including Syria, including Africa, and we will, of course, look at the potential implications for destabilising impacts in those parts of the world as well. I thank him for the points he's raised about the Ukraine Recovery Conference, and I will put on record the fact that he and the leadership of his party have made clear their enduring support for Ukraine. I know that a number of members from the Shadow Front Bench made themselves available to attend the Ukraine Recovery Conference. Of course, I have been in contact with my interlocutors in Ukraine, predominantly through digital means, through this conflict, through these unfolding events in Russia, and we will, of course, continue to do so. With regard to diplomacy in the global south, I think Prigozhin's words, and as I say, I hold no candle for that man or his organisation, but the mask slipped. He has made it clear that there was no legitimacy for this invasion. There was no genuine, or indeed, there was no risk at all to Russia's territorial integrity from NATO or others. He has made it clear that this war of aggression was driven by the egos of President Putin and the immediate cohort around him. They wanted to recreate an imperial Russia as they had in the past, and the lives of thousands of Ukrainians and others have been lost in pursuit of one man's ego. It is telling that when President Ramaphosa visited Kyiv, President Putin and his military thought it was appropriate to bomb that city whilst he was there. The very, I would say, almost performative rudeness that Putin displayed towards President Ramaphosa and those African leaders prove the lie that Russia is in any way their friends, and they should recognise that what is happening here is an assault on the UN Charter, which keeps those countries safe, and they should now recognise that Vladimir Putin's actions should be denounced.
Liz Truss.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's clear that Putin has been significantly weakened in Russia, and we must not use this time to let up in our support for Ukraine. So first of all, we need to make sure that Ukrainian membership of NATO is fast-tracked at the Vilnius NATO summit. Secondly, we need to make sure there is no talk of deals or concessions or lifting of sanctions on Russia in any circumstances until the war criminals are held to account. And finally, we and our allies, including the Ukrainians, including the Poles, including the Baltic states, need to make sure that we have a plan in the case of the implosion of Russia. Does my right honourable friend agree?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Chairman, my right honourable friend makes incredibly important points. I have said regularly that Ukraine's transformation on the battlefield proves how serious they are about the reform programme that will see them ultimately become a member of NATO, and that action should mean that however long that NATO membership would otherwise have taken, it should of course now be truncated. I've made that point clear, and I know that is a view that's echoed by a number of NATO allies. She is absolutely right that we should recognise that some of the talk about cutting a deal, Ukraine sacrificing some of its sovereign land in the pursuit of what would only be an artificial and perhaps even just temporary peace, is completely inappropriate. Putin will not stop until he has been ejected from Ukraine by the Ukrainian people, and to that end we will continue to support them until they have achieved that end. Ultimately, we do need to make sure that the people responsible for initiating this conflict and facilitating this conflict ultimately pay for the reconstruction. That is why we brought through legislation to make sure assets remain frozen until meaningful and significant reparations have been made to help Ukraine rebuild itself after this conflict.
Drew Henry.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Prigozhin's attempted coup failed, but this shows that Putin is in a much weaker position than he was portrayed. He's had to pardon him as he's withdrawn to Belarus, and of course the Russian troops should also now withdraw from Ukraine. But until they do, the SNP sit squarely behind the words of NATO Secretary-General this morning, who said, as Russia continues its assault, it is more important than ever to continue our support for Ukraine. It is also the case that the Wagner Group should be proscribed for the crimes that they've committed. However, nothing from Russia can now be taken for granted, as we've seen. Fears that Prigozhin, now in Belarus, with Wagnerite forces, could be used to attack Kyiv are real. So what assessment has the UK government made of this threat, and what coordinated plans are there with allies to bolster Kyiv's defences in such a scenario? Now, I'm pleased that the Secretary of State has convened a COBRA. It has been reported that UK diplomats are preparing for the collapse of Putin's government. How likely does the Secretary of State see this in the short to medium term? And will they be better prepared for this collapsing regime than they were in Afghanistan? Finally, Ukraine has this morning reiterated its support calls for a simplified accession to NATO at the upcoming NATO summit, asking international partners to support this move. Can the Secretary of State put on the record his support for their accession, and can he detail any steps that his government are taking to facilitate this?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, our support for Ukraine in their self-defence is unwavering. They have earned our support, and they have shown that the equipment that we have donated and the training that we have provided has been put to good use, and that is why I have no doubt that ultimately they will endure. With regard to Belarus, we have made it clear since the start of this full-scale invasion that any action by Belarus to get involved in this conflict would be met with severe repercussions from the United Kingdom. Obviously, the sanctions package we have put in place with Russia is in large part also transposed across to Belarus, and we will of course keep a very close watch on the actions that they have taken. With regard to the reports, when I became Foreign Secretary, I ensured that the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office looked at a range of future scenarios, of course, including instability in Russia. We have always made the point, I will repeat it for sake of clarity, the leadership of Russia is for the Russian people. We do not speculate or attempt to predict. What we do is plan and put in place contingency arrangements. And so, therefore, whatever the outcome of this conflict is, we shall be prepared. But I have no doubt that with our international support and in light of the visible lack of discipline on the Russian side, the Ukrainians will prevail, and we will continue working side by side with our international partners in supporting them until they do.
Chairman of the Select Committee, Alicia Kerr.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank my right honourable friend for his statement and for prior sight of it. What we have learned over the weekend is how deep the rot sits within the Russian military and security services. We have also seen that the social contract between Putin and the people of Russia, whereby they are forced to give up their rights in response for security and stability, is utterly broken. We have also learnt the internal security apparatus is as broken as Putin's offensive military foreign capabilities. But this is not over yet, and there is too much that frankly does not add up. So can my right honourable friend please update us? How many British nationals remain in Russia, and will he now launch a register for British nationals so that we know how many are there should we need to get them out? And secondly, can my right honourable friend please update us on how the Ukrainians have capitalised on this chaos? Because we hear now they may have taken back villages held since 2014 by Russian troops, as well as having crossed the Dnipro River, which would be an enormous turning point because it would allow them to establish that bridgehead to push Russia out of southern Ukraine.
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, my honourable friend makes an incredibly important point. There is a quote, and I will paraphrase it because I don't have the precise words in front of me, but if you trade freedom for security, you end up with neither. I think the Russian people are now recognising that. With regard to what may happen in Russia in the future, as I've said, we, of course, look at scenario planning to make sure that we are able to respond to whatever happens. With regard to British nationals within Russia, as she will know, we don't force British nationals to register with the embassy, and so therefore it is not possible for us to give an accurate figure. The UK's travel advice has now for some years made it clear that we advise against all travel to any part of Russia, and we also make it clear that unless your presence in Russia is essential, then you should consider leaving by commercial routes. The House should recognise that because of the situation in Russia, because of the conflict, the ability of the UK to conduct an extraction operation as we did in Sudan would be severely limited, probably to the point of impossibility. So I reiterate our travel advice that British nationals should seek to leave the country, should consider leaving the country by commercial routes unless their presence is absolutely essential. And on her final point, of course, what we have seen in terms of these fractures, these cracks running through the Russian system, will of course had an impact on those Russian troops and those Wagner mercenaries at the front line, who will now be looking over their shoulders just as much as they will be looking forward out of their trenches. We will, of course, continue to support Ukraine in their steady and methodical recapturing of the ground that's been stolen from them by the Russian forces.
Sir Chris Bryant.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It was always a phenomenal demonstration of weakness by Putin that he chose to subcontract part of his criminal invasion of Ukraine last year to a bunch of fascists, murderers, rapists and criminals who were mercenaries in the Wagner group. But isn't it now time for us to press home the advantage? Shouldn't we be saying to every British business that has any presence in Russia, get out now, including Unilever and Mantrack and Infosys and all the rest of them? Isn't it time that we seized Russian state assets that are presently sitting in British banks to give them to the reconstruction of Ukraine? And can the Foreign Secretary please explain to me why we have still not handed over the money that was taken from the sale of Abramovich's Chelsea to the charity that has been set up to reconstruct Ukraine?
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman sadly displays a lack of knowledge about international law. Governments cannot simply seize the assets of individuals. To do so would be in complete violation of the norms and standards of international law. We have passed legislation, making it very clear that frozen assets will remain frozen until significant and appropriate reparations are made by those individuals and entities that have facilitated the conflict. With regard to the Chelsea frozen assets, I refer him to the answer I gave to him when he asked his factually incorrect question at the Foreign Affairs Select Committee.
Order. No, not from the front bench. You don't speak to be heard while sitting down. Tobias Elwood.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Russian leaders have a reputation of eliminating or locking up those that show public dissent. So it is a sign of Putin's weakness that the leader of a full-scale mutiny is offered exile. Would he agree, though, that it's also expectant of any dictator to blame the international community, to blame outside interference for domestic woes? But Putin can't do that this time because he's directly responsible for the Wagner Group. That's his creation, his private army, and he's responsible also for the Ukraine war. But would he also agree that Putin may be wounded, Putin's days may be numbered, but he is likely to stoop low in order to stay in power and to justify his invasion of Ukraine?
Secretary of State.
My right honourable friend makes a number of very important points. Prior to this invasion, Vladimir Putin's desire was to limit other countries joining NATO. Because of his attack, we've had direct applications from Sweden and NATO. Sweden and Finland. Finland has now joined NATO. Sweden well on the way to doing so. His desire was to prevent Ukraine further integrating with Western structures. His invasion has driven Ukraine to do that very thing. His invasion was meant to fracture NATO, fracture the transatlantic alliance. It has strengthened it. He created the Wagner Group to bolster his power in Russia, and his creation has undermined his authority. Everything that Vladimir Putin has done has been counterproductive to his own explicit aims. That is why I have no doubt that with our continued support and the support of the international community, Ukraine will prevail, they will win, and they will return their country to its sovereignty.
Valerie Vaz.
Deputy Speaker, can I start by wishing the Foreign Secretary and his family well? At the NATO PA in Luxembourg, we unanimously passed a declaration with a clause that specifically recognises the Wagner Group as a criminal and terrorist organisation. Could he ensure that the Prime Minister also supports this at the Vilnius summit?
Secretary of State.
Madam Speaker, the Right Honourable Lady makes an important point about the nature of the Wagner Group. I know there are variations of definitions about how to describe them. The UK sanctions the Wagner Group in its entirety and certain key members of it as well. And we will continue to ensure that we undermine the ability of that mercenary organisation to create conflict, not just in Ukraine, but around the world.
James Sunderland.
Madam Deputy Speaker, my instinct here is that there's an awful lot more to this than meets the eye, and no doubt as military intelligence, the foreign intelligence bears fruit, we'll know more. Given, however, that NATO's imperative has to be to eject Russian forces from Ukraine and not interfere in domestic Russian affairs, can I please ask the Foreign Secretary whether he feels that this now makes a Ukraine victory in Ukraine more or less likely?
My honourable and gallant friend will know how important the moral component is in the success of a military operation. Those Russian troops, those Wagner mercenaries, will now be less confident about the logistics supply to the front line, to the integrity of their military leaders and the strength of their military planning. That will inevitably make them less effective as a fighting force. However, we should recognise that wars are inherently unpredictable. The Ukrainians have always had the stronger morale. their willingness to endure is legendary. And what we have seen is that Putin's expectation that it would be the West or the Ukrainians that would run out of resolve first has been shown to be a fundamentally flawed hypothesis. And what we are seeing is the cracks emerging within the Russian system rather than in the West.
Stuart Malcolm MacDonald.
I'm very grateful, Madam Deputy Speaker. The global evil that is the Wagner Group has finally come home to cause problems for the President and the Kremlin. I think the Secretary is absolutely correct to say that we shouldn't speculate on regime change. I don't think that would be helpful. So with that in mind, we should focus on what he can do. The Wagner Group, as has been mentioned a number of times, has been an evil in Syria, in Ukraine, right across the continent of Africa. So can he outline how he intends to, along with other allied countries, formulate a plan to start degrading the Wagner Group's capabilities, its logistics, its finances? And would he also give consideration to the Foreign Office funding the collection of evidence of Wagner war crimes across the world, for which many universities in this country alone would be very well placed to help with?
Madam Deputy Speaker, the honourable gentleman makes, I think, an important and valid point. We have worked closely with our international partners in terms of the collection of evidence of war crimes in Ukraine. I think he makes a very good point. I need to look at the logistical and practical implications of doing so on a wider scale. But of course, a big part of the Wagner Group's sales pitch to those vulnerable countries who employ them in lieu of having a credible armed force is their idea of invulnerability, their idea of inevitable success. That has been massively undermined by their own actions. We will continue to highlight the inappropriateness of Wagner's activity around the world, including in Africa. We will continue to impose and to impose those sanctions and enforce those sanctions to undermine the evil that that organisation does around the world.
Vicky Ford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Many commentators have pointed out that this weekend's activity may have wounded Putin, and we know that wounded animals can be very dangerous. With this in mind, how concerned is he about reports that Russian forces may have placed mines at the nuclear power plant? Are we facing the potential risk that perhaps as part of a scorched earth policy, we could see a major nuclear incident?
My right honourable friend makes a very important point. I had a meeting with Rafael Grossi, who's the Director General of the IAEA, and we discussed the safety of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, both in terms of being the centre point of a military conflict and also in light of the damage to the dam, the low water levels in the Dnieper used for cooling. I can assure you that we assess all potential credible scenarios and look to mitigate wherever we can.
Dan Jarvis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It was widely reported back in May that the UK government were actively considering proscribing the Wagner Group as a terrorist organisation. Accepting it is early days, can I ask the Foreign Secretary whether an assessment has yet been made as to what the ramifications would be for Putin if he sought to amalgamate the Wagner Group into the Russian conventional armed forces?
I thank the honourable and gallant gentleman for the point he's just made. We do, of course, keep the decisions around prescription of organisations open. It's always a cross-government department, but he will also know we do not typically comment on future prescriptions or designations. We have, of course, looked at the implication back in June when the announcement came out that volunteers were going to be contracted to the Russian Ministry of Defence. We did, of course, look at the implications of the sanction structure and others on that. I'm not at liberty to discuss the outcome of those deliberations, but I can reassure him and the House these are things that we have had under consideration.
Sir Bernard Jenkins.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Many in this House and elsewhere are commenting about the opportunity this provides to the Ukrainian armed forces to press home their advantage while the Russian command chain is in a shambles. But isn't it just a truism that the more help we can deliver to the Ukrainians. Now, the quicker we can do it, the more likely we will end this war quickly with a favourable outcome. So what are we doing to press home the advantage by galvanising ourselves and our allies to give more support to the Ukrainian armed forces?
My right honourable friend is absolutely right that the situation over the weekend does make the command and control of the Russian forces less effective. I can assure him and the House that we have never been distracted from our primary goal, which is to support the Ukrainians financially and militarily so that they can press home their counter-offensive. And I can assure him and the House that we will continue to do exactly that.
Tamanjeet Singh Dassi.
Thank you very much. Madam Deputy Speaker, media reports over the weekend suggested that President Putin decided to flee Moscow and relocate to St. Petersburg when he learned of Prigozhin's Wagner's advance towards Moscow. This, of course, is in stark contrast to President Zelensky, who bravely remained in Kiev when faced with a full-scale Russian invasion. So what assessment has the Foreign Secretary made of these reports and their veracity?
Madam Deputy Speaker, the honourable gentleman makes an incredibly important point about the personal courage that President Zelensky demonstrated at a point in time when Russian tanks were advancing on Kyiv. I've had the pleasure to meet him on a couple of occasions, and it is a genuine privilege to do so. We do, of course, look at a wide range of open source reporting. What I would say to the House is that much of this is speculative, much of this turns out to be inaccurate. We do, of course, attempt to sift as much as we can, but it's very difficult to get a clear picture about the events on the ground. So what we tend to do, as he will understand, is work on a range of potential scenarios and have our planning around the most credible, the most likely of those scenarios.
Bob Seeley.
Speaker, the latest news, if it is to be believed, is that 8,000 Wagner mercenaries are going to be joining Yevgeny Prigozhin in Belarus, in a small town called Osipovichy, where some bases, I understand, are being built under dictator Lukashenko's request. Without wishing to speculate whether this brigade-sized force is going to, in the short to medium term, be a greater threat to Lukashenko or to Putin, will he reassure us that their movements, that this base is going to be very closely monitored, given its proximity not only to Russian nuclear weapons, and we've seen the very dual loyalties that Putin, that the Russian army have towards Wagner, but also now their proximity to NATO borders.
My honourable and gallant friend makes an incredibly important point. I'm not at all sure I'd be very comfortable with 8,000 Wagner fighters being my friends anywhere or anytime soon. We have made it absolutely clear to the Belarusian government that we expect them not to be involved in and not to facilitate attacks into Ukraine. We will, of course, keep a very, very close eye on reporting around the locations and activity of those Wagner fighters in Belarus.
Paul Williams.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The United Nations Commission on Human Rights says that since the start of the war up to this May, there have been 15,000 civilian casualties. What support is this government giving in situ to these civilian victims of Russia's illegal war?
The honourable gentleman makes an incredibly important point. What we have seen horrifically is the specific targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure by Russian forces in Putin's war of aggression. The UK has, in addition to our military support, also supported the work to rebuild Ukraine and rebuild particularly the energy infrastructure that was so essential during the winter. The Ukraine Recovery Conference, which we hosted in the UK last week, also saw the commitment of 60 billion including a £50 billion promise from the European Union, which was hugely valued for Ukraine's recovery, reconstruction and reform. We will keep working to support the rebuilding of civilian infrastructure. I've witnessed that on my visits to Ukraine, and that will remain part of the UK support to the Ukrainians in their self-defence.
Jonathan Janogly.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. With the increased threat of disintegration of the Russian Federation, does my right honourable friend agree that it will become even more important to monitor and protect Russia's future leaders and influencers, like Free Russia's Vladimir Kara-Murza, already twice poisoned and now sentenced to 25 years in prison for promoting democratic values? And will he look to extending the sanctions on his tormentors from only 5 people to more of the 38 Russian state gangsters whom have been identified so far?
The work that's been done by Vladimir Kara-Murza and others like him who have stood up publicly to criticise the brutality of the Putin regime is admirable. We continue to call upon his immediate release. My right honourable friend is right, of course, that we have sanctioned a number of the individuals who have been involved with his completely inappropriate and unjustified detention. He will know that we don't speculate about future designations, but my department have heard what he said.
Sir Mark Hendrick.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I ask the Foreign Secretary if he and his department have managed to ascertain the rationale behind Prigozhin's moves towards Moscow? Was it because Russian forces were shelling the Wagner Group in Ukraine? Was he not being paid enough or being paid at all? Was he because he was critical of Shoigu and Gerasimov and the effectiveness of the Russian forces' actions in Ukraine? And indeed, why did he stop short of going as far as he could towards Moscow?
Deputy Speaker, it's hard to know with any certainty about what the trigger event for this armed advance on Moscow would be. Over a number of weeks, we've seen increasingly escalating rhetoric from Prigozhin. He has complained about his troops being starved of supplies. He's complained about ineptitude in the Russian military leadership. He has made all kinds of claims. It's not possible for us to assess which one of those is the trigger point, but of course we have been watching as his comments have become increasingly critical and increasingly intense. I think for me, the main thing that I take away from this is the fact that he makes it absolutely clear that this is a war of aggression, this is a war driven by Vladimir Putin's ego, rather than by any threat to Russia itself. And whilst there's much that we do not know and much that we do not believe, I think that I'm willing to believe that that is very much the case.
Sir James Doddridge.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Wagner Group has a nefarious interest in a whole raft of African countries below the Sahel and across Central Africa. I'm particularly concerned at places like Mali that take direct instructions from the Wagner Group as if they're the Russian government, in places like Niger, where the French get all their uranium from, the DRC, where there's all the critical minerals. In these countries, we've got small but excellent representation. Can I urge the Foreign Secretary to consult with them to see what was happening with the Wagner Group on the ground and to see if we can fill that vacuum that the Wagner Group leave in a more productive way, both for their economies and ours?
My right honourable friend makes an incredibly important point about the nature of Wagner Group's activities in Africa. I speak with African leaders, those who have Wagner mercenaries in their country or near their borders. I have highlighted the fact that these are not people that can be trusted, and any country whose defence relies upon them, as the Russians have now discovered, any countries who rely upon them for their defence are inherently vulnerable. Of course, I will talk with our representatives in Africa to look at the impact of the Wagner Group's activities and what we can do in close coordination with our international friends and allies to ensure those African countries are safe without the need for mercenary forces.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think many of us can accept the point that the Secretary of State makes about how this is a matter for the Russian people. It's an internal matter in Russia. But of course, it does have a bearing on Ukraine's self-defence. The UK MOD estimates that 60,000 Russians have been killed in the adventure in Ukraine. The BBC and its local partners have verified or confirmed about 25,000, and yet the Russian state is suggesting only 6,000 have been killed. I wonder what his department can do to try to improve the awareness in Russia of the toll that this is taking on conscripts, on soldiers and their families.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the honourable and gallant gentleman makes an incredibly important point that Vladimir Putin has not only been lying to the world about his motivations for this war of aggression, but he's been lying to the Russian people about the implications. Maintaining that lie became increasingly difficult because of the events of this weekend. Of course, our primary sympathy is with the people of Ukraine. It is their country that's being brutalised, their people that are being murdered, their women and children being raped or being stolen. But it's also the case that Russian soldiers, as Prigozhin said in his comments, are being used as cannon fodder by a Russian leader who does not care for them or their families. The more Russians see this, the more they will realise that they are just as much victims of Putin's ego as anyone else in the world. He is absolutely right. The leadership of Russia is exclusively for the Russian people, but I think the Russian people will now see how very badly they have been led.
David Jones.
Deputy Speaker, the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov has announced this today that he is content for the Wagner mercenary group to continue its activities in Africa, notwithstanding Prigozhin's role in the attempted coup over the weekend. Does my right honourable friend agree that that statement simply serves to underline the increasing weakness of the Russian regime? But does he also agree that a leaderless Wagner is potentially even more dangerous and demands the most careful scrutiny by the United Kingdom and its allies?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, my right honourable friend makes an incredibly important point. It is not possible for us to predict. I do not intend to speculate, but he's absolutely right. The events over this weekend have made things potentially more dangerous in all the places where Wagner is active and more predictable, which is why we must and we will keep a very close eye on Wagner Group activities, not just in Ukraine, but around the world. And we'll seek to show those leaders who are relying on Wagner that their reliance on that mercenary group is wholly ill-placed.
Derek Twick.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. There's no doubt that the events of this weekend show again why we need to ramp up our support for Ukraine. And my question to the Foreign Secretary is this about intelligence. Is he, because we've heard various scenarios and views about what went on and what the consequences are this weekend, is he concerned that really having trouble getting decent intelligence on what's going on in the Russian leadership and that support group around Putin and those power brokers? And really, what are we doing about that? Because in fact, his answer to my honourable friend and member for Preston sort of underlined that point. So I have a concern that we really are struggling to get any real intelligence of what's going on inside Russia.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the honourable gentleman will understand it's a long-standing convention in the House that we do not discuss intelligence matters at the dispatch box.
Well, that's not even true.
Philip Holloway.
What is his estimate of the number of Wagner troops deployed in the Ukrainian theatre, and what's his estimate of the proportion of those who will agree to come under Russian military command on the 1st of July?
My honourable friend asks an important question. The figures are, of course, now massively less predictable than they were just 72 hours ago. We will, of course, keep a very close eye to see which troops might transfer to the Russian Ministry of Defence, which troops might still desire to remain independent, and Russia's reaction to them. This is a continually evolving situation. We will, of course, keep a close eye on it, and we will ensure, however, throughout this, that we remain absolutely committed to supporting Ukraine in their counter-offensive.
Dave Duggan.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the events of this weekend shine a spotlight on the weakness of the Putin regime in Russia. But we knew the weakness was there anyway, because that's the whole reason for invading in the most aggressive and unprovoked manner, to deflect attention from the internal travails within Russia. Nevertheless, though, whatever this weekend's events, Prigozhin is not a catalyst for peace. He is not an advocate for good governance, and he is no friend of anybody in the international rules-based system. So does the Foreign Secretary agree with me that the international community must maintain the utmost vigilance with how this dynamic between Prigozhin and Putin unwinds? And can he advise the House that what will that vigilance look like from a UK perspective?
Madam Deputy Speaker, the honourable gentleman makes incredibly important points. The Prigozhin, the Wagner Group, have been responsible, not just in Ukraine but other parts of the world, for truly appalling acts of violence. So he is absolutely right. The fact that Prigozhin turned into an enemy of Putin does not suddenly make him a friend of ours. We remain absolutely clear-eyed about the nature of that individual, the nature of that organisation. And I can assure him, and of course I won't go into detail, but I can assure him we will be keeping a very, very close eye on their activities, not just in the European theatre, but in other parts of the world as well.
Robin Miller.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is wise that we're not drawn into speculation in this chamber about what is happening or has happened in Russia. But it's important that we're not distracted and remain focused on supplying and support for Ukraine in the bloody conflict that they are engaged in as it continues. So can he assure the House then that that military support for Ukraine will continue, and on this practical point, the delivery of military equipment, as requested and agreed here, in particular vital air defence missiles?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I can assure my honourable friend that throughout the high-profile events of this weekend in the UK, and I confirm this in my phone call with G7 foreign ministers, our friends around the world remain relentlessly focused on providing the Ukrainians with what they need, where they need it, when they need it, to give themselves the very best chance of a successful counter-offensive this year.
Alison Tulis.
It was apparently reported in the Wall Street Journal that the US is considering delaying further sanctions on the Wagner Group after this weekend's events. Given all that he has said about the danger that the Wagner Group presents worldwide, can he comment any further on where the UK stands on further sanctions against them?
Madam Deputy Speaker, the UK has sanctioned the Wagner Group in its entirety and members within it. Obviously, it would be inappropriate for me to comment on other countries' sanctions decision, although I would make the point that whilst we regularly do a compare and contrast between government sanctions, our domestic legislations mean the nature of our sanctions do not always match exactly, but both the US and the UK and our friends around the world are relentlessly focused on the evil that's being perpetrated by this organisation. We will continue to respond robustly.
Simon Fell.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. My right honourable friend is quite right not to speculate on the implications to the Russian state after the events of the last couple of days, and to focus instead on the illegal invasion of Ukraine. But on that, the rebuilding of the state is also important, and one of the clearest routes to doing so is to use the seized assets of kleptocrats and criminals to help that rebuilding effort. Would my right honourable friend agree?
The UK government's position has been clear. Those people who funded, facilitated, supported this brutal invasion of Ukraine have got to be the people that bear the brunt for its rebuilding. At the Ukraine Recovery Conference last week, a huge number of countries were represented, almost 60 countries represented, companies with a combined net value in the excess of $5 trillion. Were at the organisation, at the event. All of us were committed to make sure we support Ukraine in its recovery. But whilst we may look to de-risk, whilst we may look to pump prime, and whilst we may look to give the first line of support, ultimately the people responsible for this destruction should be the people responsible for rebuilding.
Jim Shannon.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I first of all thank the Foreign Secretary very much for his statement and for the encouragement that he gives this House, and more importantly the encouragement that he gives Ukraine, and thank him for that. With the very interesting developments in Russia over the last few days, will the Foreign Secretary outline what steps have been taken to send the message to Putin that whilst Putin's alliances are on a shaky footing, the alliance of those in support of Ukraine has never been more solid and more strong? And does the Foreign Secretary believe now is the time to increase support to Ukraine in terms of arms and aid to underline that very point? Thank you.
Madam Deputy Speaker, we wait for the honourable gentleman from Strangford's contribution often in debates, because he's always thoughtful and has an unerring ability to hit the nail on the head when it comes to the main thrust of our debates. And he is absolutely right in his assessment that Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine believing Ukraine was vulnerable and fragile, that the West were vulnerable and fragile, that somehow we were fickle and that we lacked resolve. And what we have seen in the intervening 15 or 16 months is the Ukrainians standing firm, their alliance of friends getting larger and stronger by the day, and the commitment that we saw at the Ukraine Recovery Conference underlines that. And indeed, it is Russia, it is Putin and the mercenaries that he's contracted to do his brutality that have shown fragility and fracture. And he is absolutely right. Now is the time to enhance our support to Ukraine, to give them not just the encouragement and the political support, but the practical support, the finances and the military support to get the job done. And I can assure him and the House that is exactly what we're going to do.
That's it. Done. You've already called on.
That concludes proceedings on the... So it always concludes proceedings when the honourable member for Strangford asks the last question. Concludes proceedings on the Foreign Secretary's statement. Thank you very much. I will pause for a moment to allow the change in personnel. And before we come to the next statement, I am required to put on record Mr. Speaker's disappointment that an important policy has not been announced first to this House. Not only have ministers been on the airwaves training the policy on lung cancer, but a detailed press notice appeared on the department's website well before the start of this statement. Mr. Speaker has repeatedly made it clear that such announcements should be made first to this House, and that to do otherwise is discourteous to this House, and this practice must not continue.
Hear, hear. Hear.
Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, Steve Barclay.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And first, may I address those remarks on behalf of Mr. Speaker. Of course, any disappointment expressed by Mr. Speaker is a matter of concern. No discourtesy was, of course, wished on the part of the government. It may be helpful just to clarify that no change of policy is being announced in this statement. It is an expansion of an existing policy, which I hope the House will regard as good news. But of course, we very much take on board any concerns that Mr. Speaker has expressed. Madam Deputy Speaker, with permission, I would like to make a statement on our national lung cancer screening programme for England. Around a quarter of patients who develop lung cancer are non-smokers. And we all remember our much-missed friend and colleague, the former member for Old Bexley and Sidcup, James Brockenshaw. He campaigned tirelessly to promote lung cancer screening and was the first MP to raise a debate on this in Parliament. His wife, Cathy, is continuing the brilliant work that James started in partnership with the Roy Castle Lung Cancer Foundation. In 2018, after returning to work following his initial diagnosis and treatment, James told this House that the government should commit to a national screening programme and use the pilot to support its implementation. He said, and I quote, and I'm sure many colleagues in the chamber will recall, "If we want to see a step change in survival rates, to see people living through rather than dying from lung cancer, now is the time to be bold." Now, despite being a non-smoker, James knew that the biggest cause of cancer was smoking, and the most deprived communities had the highest number of smokers. And that's why I'm delighted that today the Prime Minister and I have announced targeted national lung cancer screening programmes at a national level, building on our pilot, which will be targeted at those who smoke, who have smoked in the past. Lung cancer takes almost 35,000 lives across the UK every year, more than any other cancer. Often patients do not have any discernible symptoms of lung cancer until it is well advanced. In fact, 40% of cases present at A&E. Since its launch in 2019, And even with the pandemic making screening more difficult, our pilot programme has already given 2,000 lung cancer patients in deprived English areas an earlier diagnosis. And that matters because when cancer is caught at an early stage, NHS England state patients are nearly 20 times more likely to get at least 5 years to spend with their families. We all know smoking is the leading cause of lung cancer. It's responsible for almost 3/4 of cases, and in deprived areas, people are 4 times more likely to have smoked. So we've deployed mobile lung trucks equipped with scanners to busy car parks in 43 deprived areas across England. Before the pandemic, patients from these areas had poor early diagnosis rates, with only 1/3 of cases caught at stage 1 or 2. To put that in context, while a majority of patients diagnosed at stage 1 or 2 get to spend at least 5 more years with their children and grandchildren, less than 1 in 20 of those diagnosed at stage 4 are as fortunate. But thanks to our targeted programme, 3/4 of lung cancer cases in these communities are now caught at stage 1 and 2. Targeted lung cancer checks work. They provide a lifeline for thousands of families, and we need to build on this progress. And that's why we are expanding this programme, so anyone in England between the ages of 55 and 74 who is at high risk of developing lung cancer will be eligible for free screening, following the UK National Screening Committee's recommendations that this will save lives. This will be the UK's first, and indeed Europe's second, national lung cancer screening programme. And if results match our existing screening, and there's no reason to think they won't, when it's fully implemented, this programme will catch 8,000 to 9,000 people's lung cancer at an early stage each year. Each and every year, this means there will be around 16 people in every English constituency alive 5 years after their diagnosis who wouldn't have been without the steps we are taking today. That means many more Christmases or religious festivals with the whole family sat around the table. Alongside screening to detect conditions earlier, we are also investing in technology to speed up diagnosis. We're investing £123 million in AI tools, such as VeChest, which allows radiologists to review lung cancer X-rays 40% faster. So suspicious X-rays are followed up sooner and patients begin treatment more quickly.